I think we are all here, commissioners, board members, so let us get started. Good morning, everybody. The time is 10:02. This is the July 7, 2022 Planning Board meeting called to order. We have the following board members with us. We have Vice Chair Bailey, we have Commissioners Washington and Commissioner Giraldo, and I am Chair Shapiro. And on to the business at hand. Please note that the deadline for all participant pre-registration and for all submission of materials and exhibits was 12 noon on the Tuesday before this planning board meeting. This deadline is shown on the screen and announced in every weekly meeting. It's posted on our website and it is stated in bold red in our weekly published planning board agenda. Registered speakers may join the meeting with the link provided in the email provided by the planning board office or listen by phone by utilizing the call-in number provided in the email. And of course, anyone may tune in to watch the planning board meeting via live stream. If you wish to speak or become a person of record, you may use our online web form, which you see on the screen before you. In addition, the commissioners were joined by Peter Goldsmith, our senior counsel, the deputy planning director, Derek Balaj. We have Jessica Jones, our planning board administrator, Joe Parsons, our technical hearing writer, James Hunt, the division chief for the Development Review Division, and then we have Mr. Kenneth Flanagan, who's guiding us through the exhibits, as well as Lydia Thompson and Dan Hartman, who are helping us with technology behind the scenes. And on to our agenda items. Our first item on the agenda is a resolution. It's a PGCPB number 2022-81, resolution of support for Park and Recreation Professionals Day. Just a quick note on what this item is, and I believe we are joined by Mr. Bill Tyler, who is the director of the Department of Parks and Recreation as well. So this resolution is to show our support for Park and Recreation Professionals Day. Nearly 3,800 skilled professionals work within the Department of Parks and Recreation in Prince George's County, working to strengthen community cohesion, connecting people with nature and each other, and promoting opportunities for healthy living, for equitable living, and for environmental sustainability. Our professionals play a vital role in the protection of our environment and offer a range of services that enrich the lives of our community members and contribute to economic opportunity and help make Prince George's County a great place to live, to work, to play, and to visit. So Park and Recreation Professionals Day has evolved into a truly national celebration. And we, the planning board, through this resolution, recognize July 15th, 2022 as Park and Recreation Professionals Day. And we endorse community-wide celebrations as a reminder of the efforts of dedicated professionals who contribute to the strong, vibrant, and thriving communities with all the programming and all the stellar services that we have. And before I turn to my fellow board members, let me turn to Mr. Director Tyler to see if you have anything that you would like to say on this auspicious day for Parks and Recreation.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the Planning Board. By recognition, you are certainly recognizing and acknowledging the great works of the men and women of the Department of Parks and Recreation, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in Prince George's County, and we really thank you for that. We thank you so much for your support, and it's really, really a great opportunity to be recognized, and we thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, before we turn to the commissioners, I just want to say, as you know, I'm newer to this role, and I've just had such a wonderful experience working with Director Tyler and the rest of his team, and getting the opportunity to meet so many wonderful, dedicated professionals throughout the Department of Parks and Recreation. So it's just been a delight for me as well. So commissioners, anything to add? And if not, there is a resolution before us, PGCPB number 2022-81.
I move approval.
Mr. Chairman, the resolution for support for Park and Recreation Professionals Day.
Second.
We have a motion by Vice Chair Bailey, a second by Commissioner Washington. Under discussion, Under discussion, let me also note that the state of Maryland, on a related matter, but this is not the resolution, that the state of Maryland also has issued a proclamation that July 2022 is Park and Recreation Month. This is from the government. So just to note that as well, and I'll be sure to, if you haven't got that, to send that out to all of you in the materials that you get on a regular basis. So with that, if no further discussion, I'll call the roll. Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
I vote aye, and I'd just like to add, Mr. Chair, that we are an award-winning Parks and Recreation Department. We have won 6 awards nationwide for having some of the best parks and recreation programs. And I know that under Mr. Tyler and under his deputies and the rest of the staff, that this will continue to be. And hopefully we will soon be or receive number 7. Thank you. And I
Thank
vote
you.
aye.
Thank you. And I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. Thank you. Thank you, Director Tyler, and thanks everyone for this.
Thank you.
Moving on to our next item. We have our consent agenda. Hold on one sec while I shuffle through my paperwork, folks. We have our consent agenda. We have a few items on the consent agenda, items 4D and E. Is there a motion to approve items 4D and E on the consent agenda? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped the minutes. I knew I was shuffling for a
Right.
reason. Okay, so pull back from that. We have item 2, which is a motion to approve the draft minutes of June 30, 2022. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Move
Mr.
approval. Second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Washington, second by Vice Chair Bailey. No discussion. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Washington,
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey,
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. I'm skipping item 3 because, and I'll note this later, but we're going to be taking up item 3 at the end of our agenda. So now we have the consent agenda. So is there a motion to approve items 4D and E on the consent agenda?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Items on
Consent agenda.
We have a motion and second. No discussion on the motion. I will call the roll. Vice Chair Bailey,
Vote aye.
Commissioner Washington,
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. The consent agenda is approved. So now as we move on, here's how we will go through the agenda items of the day. We'll be discussing things in the following order. We'll start with items 7 through 9, 7, 8, 9. Then we will take up items 5 and 6. We will then conclude with item 3A. So again, 7, 8, 9, 5 and 6, and then 3A. So we're starting with item 7. Item 7 is detailed site plan, DSP 21014, 4100 Laurel Road property. The staff reviewer on this is Ms. Butler. And I will turn to Ms. Butler, and hold on one sec for me. I just want to make sure that yeah, this is the applicant has revisions to the conditions. Let me turn it to staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Board. For the record, I'm Tiara Butler with the Urban Design Section. The staff recommends that Planning Board hearing be moved from July 7th, 2022 to September 8th, 2022. The continuance is necessary to allow time for the applicant to satisfy the stormwater management concept requirement with DPI. In conclusion, staff recommends that the Planning Board approve the request for the continuance and schedule the application for Planning Board hearing date September 8th, 2022. And this concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. I appreciate it. So the motion would be to approve the continuance to September 8th, 2022. Any questions? If not, is there a motion?
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Before we get into the motion, just wanted to confirm that there's been a waiver of the mandatory action timeframe as well, I believe.
As there.
Okay.
That'll be
Is that a
included in
sep-
that as well.
Is that a
Yes.
separate action we need to take, or is that included in this action?
It'll be
No, that's
included.
applicant's waiver, correct, Mr. Hunt? He's
Yes, ma'am.
he's already submitted it.
I have the waivers action item. Am I misunderstanding this?
There should be a waiver, Mr. Chair, from the applicant.
But
There
there's
should be a
no
wa-
action for
Mr.
us.
Chairman,
to
this is
take.
Peter Gold. This is Peter Golds, the senior counsel. The waiver needs to come from the applicant. It's not an action.
Let me turn to Mr. Goldsman. Hold on one sec. Take it away, Peter.
The waiver of the waiver of the mandatory action deadline is from the applicant. It's not an action that the board needs to take. And so I think Ms. Butler just needed to confirm that we did receive that waiver.
That is correct, and it is in the additional backup.
Okay.
So the waiver is in the backup. We note that. And then the action before us, noting that there is the waiver, that the motion before us is to approve the continuance to September 8, 2022. That's the only thing, the only action we're taking.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, so noted. Is there a motion to approve the continuance to September 8th?
Move
Motion to
Mr.
approve
Chairman.
September the 8th,
I'll second.
2022.
I've got Vice Chair Bailey with the motion. I have Commissioner Washington with a second. Any discussion on the motion? I'll call the roll. Vice Chair Bailey,
But I,
Commissioner Washington,
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0 for the continuance. And now we're on to item 8, which is a waiver of the rules of procedure. 4-05109 Goodman Heights. Let me turn to Ms. Gupta. If you have some brief comments to explain what we have before us.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. For the record, I am Mridula Gupta with the subdivision section. Item number 8 on the agenda is a request for a waiver for the planning board rules of procedure. And item number 9 is a reconsideration request for preliminary plan of subdivision 4-05109. Excuse me, Goodman Heights. The planning board approved the preliminary plan on January 25th, 2007, and the resolution was adopted on March 1, 2007 by a letter dated June 15, 2022. The applicant's representative, Mr. Holler, requested the waiver of the rules of procedure first, and if granted, a reconsideration of finding 4 of the resolution on the basis of inadvertence or other good cause. This finding 4 is related to the environmental impacts which were approved with this preliminary plan of subdivision. The request for a waiver of the rules of procedure and the reconsideration request for the preliminary plan are granted. Staff will provide further analysis on the merits of the request at a later planning board hearing. This concludes staff's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta. And as we're noting, Ms. Gupta is referring to items 8 and item 9, even though with any action that we'll take them in that order. Any questions for Ms. Gupta about this, or do you need to hear from Mr. Haller on this, board members?
I'd like to hear from Mr. Haller.
You would. Okay, Mr. Haller, you want to take this on?
Absolutely. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Thomas Haller. I'm an attorney with offices in Largo, and I'm here today representing LAH Goodman LLC, which is the owner of the property that is highlighted in red before you today. As the staff report notes, this is a approximately 12-acre parcel that was subdivided for 28 lots and back in 2007. And at the time that the property was subdivided, we were required to do a natural resources inventory, which we did. And that natural resources inventory was approved by staff based upon the information that was in front of both of us at the time, both staff and the applicant. The current owner of the property purchased it in 2018. It had not developed yet because of the recession, but they purchased it with the intent of developing the property. When the subdivision was originally evaluated, the impacts to the regulated environmental features were also evaluated and were approved. And there was a condition imposed that before we could obtain any county permits, we had to obtain a permit from Maryland Department of the Environment for those environmental impacts. The work to permit those impacts was done in 2000, following 2018 after my client purchased the property. And in the process of evaluating or processing the permit, it was determined that there were some additional regulated environmental features which had not been flagged or had not been identified back in 2007, which were actually included in the application to MDE. MDE has now approved a permit for the disturbance of the regulated environmental features, which is predominantly small areas of isolated wetlands. But those regulated environmental features differ slightly from what was approved back in 2007. Where we are at this particular point in time is that there are recreational facilities that were approved by the planning board in conjunction with the approval of the subdivision. And in order to construct those facilities, we need a detailed site plan. And so as we prepared the detailed site plan, a new natural resource inventory was approved in 2022. And that natural resource inventory showed the regulated environmental features as was approved by MDE, but that conflicts with what the planning board approved back in 2007. So we were advised by staff that in order to process our detailed site plan to construct the recreational facilities, we needed to reconsider the subdivision to make sure that the impacts to the regulated environmental features were not only consistent, but were evaluated and approved by the planning board. So with regard to the suspension of the rules, we submit that there's good cause to suspend the rules because the discrepancy between the regulated environmental features that exist today was not known and could not have been known at that point in time because the NRI was approved concurrent with the subdivision. And then we believe there's also good cause to reconsider this matter because ensuring that the regulated environmental features are fully evaluated is in the public interest and it's in accordance with the requirements of the subdivision ordinance. So we would request that the board suspend the rules to allow us to proceed with the reconsideration. If the board approves the reconsideration, then we would submit a revised variation request to address the impact on the regulated environmental features, and that would be addressed by the planning board at a future date.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haller. Questions on this for Mr. Haller and Ms. Gupta?
No,
Okay, so the first thing before us would be item number 8, which is the waiver of the rules of procedure. Is there a motion to grant a waiver of the rules of procedure?
Move approval, Mr. Chairman.
Second that.
Second.
With motion by Commissioner Washington, second by Commissioner Giraldo. No discussion. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0 to grant the waiver of the rules of procedure. And now before us is the request to grant a reconsideration hearing for preliminary plan of subdivision 4-05109 Goodman Heights. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the request for reconsideration for preliminary plan 4-05109 based on due to inadvertence and other good cause and also in furtherance of substantial public interest.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion by Commissioner Washington, a second by Commissioner Giraldo. No discussion. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. Thank you, Mr. Howard. Thank you, Ms. Gupta.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
You too. So we're now on to item 5. This is preliminary plan of subdivision 4-21010 Marlboro Gateway. The staff reviewer for this is Mr. Diaz Campbell. We have the attorney for the applicant, Nate Foreman. Let me turn it to staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. For the record, I am Eddie Diaz Campbell, Senior Planner with the Subdivision Section.
We see you, but we don't. We hear you, but we don't see you. You missed your face, so we'll give you a second.
Can you see me now?
Oh, we can see you.
Yep.
Okay.
Take it away.
All right. Item number 5 on the agenda is the preliminary plan of subdivision for Marlborough Gateway 4-21010. The subject project proposes 5 parcels for the development of 150 multifamily dwelling units and 10,000 square feet of commercial development. The 150 multifamily dwelling units are proposed to be affordable housing units, with 9 of the units additionally proposed to be senior housing units. As a matter of housekeeping, staff has received 1 item of additional backup, which was received before the noon deadline on July 5. This is a letter from the applicant requesting 5 revisions to the recommended conditions of approval. Next slide, please. The site is located in the eastern part of Prince George's County within Planning Area 79 and Council District 6, near the town of Upper Marlboro. Next slide, please. More specifically, the site is located northwest of the intersection of US 301 and Maryland 725. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The zoning map shows that the property is in the Residential Multifamily 48, or RMF 48 zone. Lands north and west of the property are also zoned RMF 48. East of the property is US 301, with land in the commercial service and agricultural residential zones beyond. South of the property is Maryland 725, with land in the industrial employment zone beyond. Next slide, please. Property zoning notwithstanding, this preliminary plan subdivision is reviewed under the prior zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations, pursuant to section 24-1703B of the subdivision regulations. Under the prior zoning ordinance, this site was in the mixed-use transportation-oriented, or MXT zone. This preliminary plan subdivision was therefore evaluated according to the standards of the MXT zone. The property was placed into the MXT zone to implement the recommendation of the 2013 approved Subregion 6 Master Plan that the property be used for mixed-use development, and the policies and strategies of the plan applicable to this property specifically recommend both residential and commercial uses. Next slide, please. The aerial photograph shows that the site currently has 4 single-family detached dwellings in the southern part of the site, which are proposed to be raised. Because these houses were part of an African-American community that settled in the area shortly after the Civil War, staff is recommending that each house be recorded on a Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form before demolition. The northeastern part of the site is wooded, while the northwestern part has wetlands and an existing pond. Also visible on the aerial are uses surrounding the property, including a single-family dwelling and a gas station between the site boundary and the intersection of US 301 and Maryland 725, various commercial and industrial uses east of US 301 and south of Maryland 725, and single-family detached dwellings north and west of the site. One site on the west side of US 301, just north of the property, is a mixed-use development under construction known as the Towns at Peerless Project. Next slide, please. This photo shows another view of the site from an aerial perspective, viewed from east of the site. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The site map shows that the site has a hilly topography, with the highest, flattest elevations in the center and eastern portions of the site. Parts of the site will be graded to allow placement of the buildings on the high, flat areas. Next slide, please. The master plan right-of-way map shows US 301 and Arterial Road in red, Maryland 725 and Largo Road, which are primary roads, in pink, master plan freeway F10 in orange, master plan expressway E6 in purple, and master plan primary road P609 in pink. Adequate right-of-way dedication to Maryland 725 for its alternate 70-foot right-of-way is provided with this preliminary plan of subdivision. Next slide, please. The 4 critical intersections determined to be impacted by the development are shown by the yellow squares on this slide and are further described in detail in the staff report. The analysis performed by staff found that all of the signalized intersections will operate adequately under total traffic conditions if the intersection of US 301 and Maryland 725 is improved as detailed by the 2022 to 2027 Capital Improvement Program. Staff is recommending that the applicant be required to contribute to funding the improvements at this intersection. The methodology for calculating the specific fee to be paid is shown on pages 14 to 15 of the staff report. The analysis also found that a traffic signal warrant analysis should be conducted for the site's entrance onto Maryland 725. There is an expectation on the part of staff and the applicant that the development will be phased, with the residential and commercial portions constructed at different times. Staff is therefore recommending via Condition 17 that each detailed site plan include a phasing plan to show when the signal will be provided, if it is warranted, relative to the development of the site and the two proposed access points. Clarifying language for this condition, agreed to by staff and the applicant, is included in the additional backup. The study will help ensure that adequate transportation facilities will exist for each phase of development before the overall project is concluded. Next slide, please. The preliminary plan shows 5 parcels outlined in red. Existing public rights-of-way are shown in dark blue, while proposed access easements are shown in light blue. The primary management area is shown in pink. Adequate public facilities, including water, sewer, fire, rescue, and police facilities, are available to serve the site. On-site recreation facilities are proposed to be provided to meet the mandatory dedication of parkland requirement. Staff supports the provision of on-site recreation facilities, but recommends that a noise study be provided at the time of detailed site plan, in order to ensure the facilities will be adequately protected from noise generated by US 301. The proposed access easements are recommended by staff pursuant to Section 24-128B9 of the subdivision regulations, in order to reduce the number of driveway entrances to US 301 and Maryland 725, and thereby improve the overall safety of the on-site circulation. Staff does recommend, however, that the 2 easements be combined into a single easement in order to ensure there will be cross-access between the residential and commercial portions of the site. The specific boundaries of the easement may be refined at the time of detailed site plan if necessary. Section 24-121A3 of the subdivision regulations requires that no parcel have direct access to an arterial road such as US 301. The applicant has therefore filed a request for a variation from this section in order to allow the proposed access onto US 301 from parcels 3 and 4. Staff recommends approval of this variation for the reasons discussed in the site access and layout finding of the staff report. Next slide, please. This application is subject to the Woodland Conservation Ordinance, and a Type 1 tree conservation plan has been filed with the application. This TCP1 shows the subject parcels in red and the rights-of-way and access easements in blue. The primary management area is shown outlined in pink, while proposed buildings are shown in yellow. The building and land area shown in gray on parcels 3 and 4 represent phase 2 of the development, for which a final site layout has not yet been determined. Woodland conservation and reforestation areas on the TCP1 are shown in green. The requirements of the Woodland Conservation Ordinance are proposed to be met with 3.48 acres of woodland preservation and 0.05 acres of reforestation. The TCP1 also shows the location of 17 specimen trees which are proposed for removal, shown by the dark green circles. The applicant submitted a request for a variance from Section 25-122B1G to allow removal of the trees. Staff supports the variance request as discussed in the environmental finding of the staff report. Next slide, please. The TCP1 also includes 2 proposed impacts to the primary management area, shown highlighted in pink on this slide. Impact 1 on the left is for installation of a stormwater outfall, while Impact 2 on the right is a temporary impact for grading associated with a nearby building. This area will be reforested upon completion of the final grading. Staff supports these impacts to the primary management area, as discussed in the environmental finding of the staff report. Next slide, please. In conclusion, subdivision staff recommends that the planning board adopt the findings and approve preliminary plan subdivision 4-21010 Marlboro Gateway, as well as Type 1 Tree Conservation Plan TCP1-011-2020-01, a variation from Section 24-121A3, and a variance from Section 25-122B1G, subject to the conditions contained in the staff report. The applicant has communicated 5 proposed revisions to conditions of approval recommended in the report, included on the record. The revisions to conditions 11 and 12 clarify the requirements to the access easement at the time of detailed site plan and final plat. The revision to condition 15 allows the capital improvement program fee for the commercial development to be paid on a per square foot basis, in case not all of the commercial development is to be constructed at the same time. The revision to condition 17 clarifies the purpose of the traffic signal warrant study, as discussed previously. The revision to condition 27 corrects the requirements for the 90 senior housing units, as the requirements shown in the staff report were based on comprehensive design zoning, not applying to the subject property. Staff concurs with all the applicant's proposed revisions. The associated findings in the staff report will be revised for the resolution. This concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz-Campbell. Before we turn to the applicant, board members, are there questions for staff?
The only question that I have a question, Mr. Diaz-Campbell, do you agree with the revised conditions, applicants exhibit 1?
Yes, sir. Yes, we did. Thank you.
Thank you. No other questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Other questions for
Mr. Chair.
staff? Yes.
Yes, could he repeat his comments regarding 27, number 27 of conditions?
Yes, I can further explain that. So the specific requirements that the senior housing be insured for a minimum of 60 years and that a covenant be in place, those are those apply to a mixed retirement development in a comprehensive design zone such as RM or LAC. They wouldn't apply to the MXT zone. So we were unfortunately mistaken in putting that in the conditions. So there for this zone, there's no specific time limit on how long the senior housing units would have to be in place there. The only requirement would be that once a conversion to market rate units is proposed, they would need to come in for a new preliminary plan of subdivision.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Other questions from commissioners? Okay, before I turn to the attorney for the applicant, I just want to note that we had 2 people who signed up as opponents for this. I think we have one of them online. I just want to verify to see if they're here to make sure. We have a Ms. Talisha Roundtree and a Ms. Zula Crutchfield. Can you speak up if you're online? We're going to have you speak later. I just want to see if you're here.
Good morning. Yes, this is Talisha Roundtree. I'm online.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Roundtree. And Ms. Crutchfield? Okay, if Ms. Crutchfield does show up later, she'll have the opportunity to speak. And Ms. Roundtree will be with you in a bit. So I'll turn it to Mr. Foreman, and you can introduce your team. This is the attorney for the applicant. You can introduce your team as you see fit, and the time is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, Nathaniel Foreman with the offices of O'Malley, Mile, Nyland, and Gilmore, located in Greenbelt. And I'm here on behalf of the applicant in this case, MBID of Delaware, LLC. And as the chair had mentioned, I would like to introduce my team, most of which I believe I have seen and are here. On behalf of the applicant and the developer, Ms. Elizabeth Kim and Mr. David Holden. On behalf of our partner in the development Housing Initiative Partnership, we have Marianne Dillon. Our civil engineer for this project is Ms. Victoria Ballestero. Our traffic expert is Mr. Mike Lenhart. And on behalf of the ownership, because we are the contract purchaser and the developer, there's Mr. Matthew Tedesco, who is keeping an eye on interest from the ownership perspective. I want to begin by thanking Mr. Diaz-Campbell for his thorough and presentation this morning, and want to commend him for all of the work and assistance he has done in helping get this case over the finish line. The applicant does agree with the staff recommendation and the conditions as they have been revised. And well, Mr. Diaz-Campbell did do a great job summarizing the project. I do just want to bring a couple of items to the board's attention. And these items were actually born from the conversation that I had with Ms. Crutchfield yesterday, who was one of the citizens that had signed up. In our conversation, she had mentioned that her concerns were traffic, trees, and the potential for crime. And so I kind of want to just do a brief overview of some of those issues that we discussed and how, I think this was able to assuage her of some of those fears. Regarding the trees and the overall environmental constraints, this has been a very difficult site to work with. Even though the property itself is about 19 3/4 acres, the actual developable portion is only a little bit over 7.5 acres. So you're looking at that over 12 acres of this site is not developable. And it runs the full gamut of all the environmental constraints that you would, be wary of: streams, wetlands, steep slopes, ponds. And I think it's really a testament to the team that they've been able to bring this product forward and with only the impacting 0.11 acres of the primary management area. And even of those 0.11 acres, half of that is only a temporary impact for the grading. Once that grading has been done, we will do the replanting. So in theory, we were only having a fraction of the environmental areas being impacted by this development. And I think that's an overall great thing for this community, in that we're trying to retain the natural environment as much as possible. Yes, we have also included a request for the removal of some specimen trees. We have really worked hard to minimize those trees as much as possible. And, with 49 specimen trees over the entire property, we only have requested the removal of 17 of them. And, given the other environmental constraints of the site, I believe that's a great win for the overall development, in that we were able to keep most of those trees. If there's additional questions, I will, from the board, or discussions about the environment, I would, ask Victoria from ETCS to jump in. But that's kind of the overview about the environmental issues we have. Regarding traffic, we have developed this site in such a way that we are not going to have any major impact on the transportation on US 301 or on Maryland 725. With the variation to allow access from US 301, we think we are going upon full development of the site. We think it would be a great way for the residents and the future commercial users to access the site without having to impact the intersection of US 301 and 725. And yeah, we're working with the State Highway Association to make sure that all of our access ways are up to standard, up to code. And should a signal warrant study be required, should a signal warrant study, we are going to perform a signal warrant study, and should it be required, we can work on making the intersections even safer if necessary. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the perceived notion of affordable housing that unfortunately sometimes has the connotation of bringing with it crime. I don't want to say that I agree with that, but that is sometimes the generalization or the stigma that comes with it. I will say that the Ingerman Group, who is the applicant in this case, they have a proven track record of developing both affordable and market rate housing with over 9,000 units in the Mid-Atlantic area. They retain the properties upon the completion, and so they have a stake in making sure that they provide and deliver high quality products because they have an interest in this also. The tenants go through a thorough screening for credit levels, income levels, and a multi-state criminal background check. So, you know, there is some selection as to the residents that get to enjoy living in these areas, who we think will be productive members in of the environment and to, you know, good citizens. And I think with that, you know, I'm more than happy to answer any other questions that the board or the planning board members may have, but I kind of just wanted to give that overview of the traffic, the trees, and the perceived notion of crime. But yeah, and we're more than happy to answer any questions the board may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foreman. Appreciate it. Are there questions for Mr. Foreman or for other members of the applicant's team?
I have none.
No questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the third presentation. So let me turn to the opponents. We have Ms. Roundtree. Assuming you're still online, if you want to come on, and if you have your video on, turn it on. Otherwise, audio is fine. And Ms. Roundtree, you have up to 3 minutes, and if you could identify your name and address for the record.
Morning. Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. We can hear you
Okay.
fine.
Yes, my name is Talisha Roundtree, and I'm at 2706 Lake Forest Drive in Upper Marlboro, the Beech Tree community. My issue with this project is just that it just appears that it's more housing developments that continue to go up. I do notice that there's already low income housing that's coming up, so I'm assuming that this is the same builder with the apartments that's kind of next door and the townhouses. This area needs more retail stores, more restaurants or healthy eating facilities, and not more housing. I feel like that area, I was hoping that that area would have been developed, that whole corridor down Marlboro Pike developed with more retail stores rather than low income housing. Just listening to the additional information about, I think there was someone mentioned that this would also be senior housing. I don't know. I don't have additional information about the how many residents, how many individuals will be moving to this area. My thoughts is that I would love to be more retail space be considered. And I know that the builders are not into the retail business, but I just wanted to express my disappointment with the option of not considering additional retail for the Upper Marlboro area, especially this area where it's a limited food and it's limited stores. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Ms. Roundtree. I appreciate you coming forward and taking the time and speaking your mind on this. It's always helpful to hear folks in the community issues.
Mr. Chair, will I get a chance to respond, or?
You will, Mr. Foreman. Before you do that, let me just see if there's any questions from commissioners for Ms. Roundtree, and otherwise, then I'll turn to you, Mr. Foreman.
The only question I had was how the number I'm looking at the diagram and it looks like it's about 3 separate buildings. So I wanted to know, what is the occupancy rate for each building? What is the expected apartments or whatever that's supposed to be developed? I didn't see that in any of the documents that I received. So I just wanted to know, what is the max number of residents or individuals that will be in this area?
Okay, so thank you for that. Unless there's questions from commissioners, Mr. Foreman, if you want to take a minute and respond to some of Ms. Roundtree's questions. The other thing I'd say, Ms. Roundtree, is that, and I think Mr. Foreman, you and the applicant are more than happy to do this, but it will probably be helpful for you all to have a conversation after this as well to make sure that you have all the information that you need, Ms. Roundtree. We can do some of that right here, right now, just for a minute or two. But then there'll be a follow-up. There'll be an opportunity for you to have a lengthier follow-up conversation and get all the questions answered that you need, okay?
Thank you.
Sure. But briefly, Mr. Foreman, if you want to take on just for a minute or two some of the issues that Ms. Roundtree had, that would be helpful.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, again, Nathaniel Foreman. So the unit breakdown, while we haven't quite have to have that nailed down at this stage, because that comes at the next development approval stage, which is the detailed site plan. We have this preliminary plan is recommending that we develop 90 age-restricted housing, which will be in a single building that fronts onto Maryland 725, and 60 market rate / workforce housing units that will be in 3 separate buildings that are more to the rear of the site. And one other thing that I do want to mention, Ms. Roundtree, that as this preliminary plan proposes, and as the previous approval, the conceptual site plan also proposed, that at this stage, we are planning on developing retail commercial property along US 301. That is what we are requesting as part of this preliminary plan of subdivision. I do not want to make any promises that that is what ultimately will be developed, because I cannot say what's going to happen once the first phase of residential is built and we see what the commercial market looks like then. But as of right now, that is what we are proposing, and that is what we will be approved to construct. And the total retail commercial will be about 10,000 square feet, as shown on the preliminary plan.
Thank you, Mr. Foreman. And Ms. Roundtree, I'd say that's certainly what we would like to see as well, but there's more to come because there's further approval processes, assuming we take action on this today. So thank you, Mr. Foreman, and thank you again, Ms. Roundtree, for coming forward and for having your voice heard. Any other questions for board members? Are there any other questions for Ms. Roundtree? If not, Mr. Foreman, you have the final word. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I just would like to thank the board and for their time this morning and request that they approve the staff report and or adopt the staff finding of approval with the revised conditions. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Foreman, Commissioners, this is Mary Ann Dillon. I'm one of the partners on the development team, and I just want to point out that we're a local nonprofit community-based housing development organization. We will be providing resident services at the back end of this deal. So there are, services for all of our residents, both recreational and other kinds of services. And I do want to point out that the income limits for this project, I know there's a misnomer about what is low-income housing, but currently we will be serving people, like a family of 4 making less than $77,000 a year, or a single senior who is earning less than $54,000 a year. So it's not really very low income in. So I just want to make sure that people understand who it is that we intend to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you do in the community, have done for years and years. Appreciate all the work. Okay, so thank you. So I'll turn to my fellow board members. You've heard the case. What is your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we adopt the findings of staff and approve preliminary plan 4-21010 TCP 1-011-2020-01 and approve variation from section 24-121A3 and variance to section 25-122B1G along with the associated conditions as outlined in staff's report and is further modified by applicant exhibit number 1.
Second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Washington, a second by Commissioner Giraldo. Any discussion on the motion? I will call the roll.
I have some discussion. I just wanted to thank that we're going to have more workforce housing in the county. and additional senior space in the county so people can remain in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for those comments. And I would associate myself with those remarks. I appreciate it. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
I forgot who seconded it. Was it Commissioner Geraldo? You were the seconder?
I vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey.
But I.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. Thank you all for your participation in this case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Over here.
Have a good day, all. So now we're moving on to item 6. This is preliminary plan of subdivision 4-21047 Chance Academy. This is continued from Planning Board meeting June 9, 2022. We have the attorney for the applicant is Mr. Tao. We have our staff reviewer will be Ms. Gupta. There's a number of folks who are signed up to speak in support and in opposition to this. So we will get to that a bit down the road. Let me start with staff for the staff report. Ms. Gupta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. For the record, I am Mridula Gupta with the subdivision section. Item number 6 on the agenda is a preliminary plan of subdivision 4-21047 titled Chance Academy. The preliminary plan of subdivision proposes one parcel for development of 26,130 square feet of institutional use, specifically a private school for a maximum of 80 students. For board's indulgence, staff would like to clarify that a preliminary plan of subdivision does not approve the use, but analyzes the adequacy of a site and establishes the capacity for a proposed use. As a matter of housekeeping, the additional backup includes one exhibit received from the applicant prior to July 5th noon deadline, and 19 letters, emails, and exhibits from opposition. Next slide, please. The site is located in the northeastern area of Prince George's County within Planning Area 71A and Council District 6. Next slide, please. More specifically, the site is located approximately 2,000 feet south of the intersection of Fairwood Parkway and Fairview Vista Drive. Next slide, please. The image to the left shows that the subject property outlined in red is located in the residential estate or RE zone. The surrounding properties are located in Legacy Mixed Use Community Zone. The property's zoning notwithstanding, this preliminary plan of subdivision was accepted for review prior to April 1, 2022, and is therefore reviewed under the prior zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations pursuant to section 24-1703A of the subdivision regulations. Under the prior zoning ordinance, this site is in the RE zone as shown in the image to the right. This preliminary plan of subdivision was evaluated according to the standards of that zone. Next slide, please. This site is located in Aviation Policy Area 6 within the proximity of the Freeway Airport. This overlay zone requires that every application demonstrate compliance with the height restriction, which is 50 feet in this area, and will be evaluated with the site plan. Next slide, please.
Ms. Gupta, your voice went kind of soft on us. I just want to make sure that we can hear it. So if you could adjust your microphone.
Is it better now, Mr. Chair?
It is better now. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Keep
thank
going.
you. The aerial photograph shows the site, which is a Prince George's County designated historic site known as Fairview. These existing structures on site, including the historic house and brick garage, will remain as part of the proposed development. One shed located along the western edge of the site and adjacent to Goodlow's Promise Drive is proposed to be raised. Next slide, please. The site map shows the site delineated on the slide in pink and the historic house located on top of a knoll. Next slide, please. This slide shows that there are no master planned rights of way in the immediate vicinity of the site. Next slide, please. The critical intersections determined to be impacted by the development are highlighted with yellow circles on the slide. The analysis performed by staff found that all critical intersections will operate at adequate levels of service given the proposed development. Next slide, please. This is the bird's eye view of the property, which is outlined in blue, looking westward. The historic house on the property and the surrounding single-family residential development can be seen. Next slide, please. This slide shows the outline of the new parcel in red and the surrounding public rights-of-way shaded in purple. The existing buildings on the site are shaded in orange. There are two existing 22 feet wide ingress and egress easements that provide access to a public street, which are highlighted on this slide in blue. While police facilities are found to be adequate to serve the subject site, fire and rescue travel time is not adequate for the site. Condition 10 is recommended to require the applicant to request a pre-incident emergency plan from the county's fire and EMS department and install adequate equipment at each building as further detailed in the staff report on pages 9 and 22. Redesignation of the subject property from water and sewer category 4 to category 3 will also be necessary prior to final plat approval. Additional archaeological investigations are recommended if any identified historic features will be impacted by construction. Architectural compatibility of the proposed structures within the environmental setting will be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission at the time of the detailed site plan. Review of architectural compatibility will include consideration of the size, scaling, mass, architecture and materials, as well as lighting and landscaping of the proposed campus buildings. The construction of the campus and future modifications will require obtaining approved historic area work permits, which will be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission and the MNCPPC staff. Conditions 9 and 11 are recommended in the staff report to address these requirements. Next slide, please. The Type 1 tree conservation plan shows the subject site outlined in red and the on-site woodland preservation areas shown here in green. There are no regulated environmental primary management areas on the property. Woodland conservation requirement for this development is proposed to be addressed with on-site woodland preservation and specimen tree credits. The applicant has requested a variance from section 25-122B1G, which requires preservation of historic trees, which are defined as those trees which are part of a historic site or are associated with a historic structure. This preliminary plan of subdivision proposes removal of two historic trees on the site, the location of which are shown by red crosses on the slide. These trees are in good condition and are located within the proposed driveway and stormwater facility. Staff supports the variance for the removal of these two trees requested by the applicant based on the findings on pages 17 to 19 of the staff report. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the additional backup includes 1 applicant exhibit and 19 exhibits in opposition. Applicant exhibit 1 includes proposed revision to staff's recommended condition 12B, which appears on page 23 of the staff report. This condition pertains to the provision of sidewalks on both sides of the main entrance driveway to the property. Staff has reviewed the suggested revision and concur with the revision. The sidewalks as required by this condition will be located off-site and will require the applicant to obtain additional easement from Fairwood Community Association, which owns the adjoining open space. Following this preliminary plan of subdivision, if approved, the development review of the site will include additional site plan applications, the exact location and design of all buildings and structures, parking lots, open spaces, landscaping, grading, and other on-site physical features will be provided and reviewed with a subsequent site plan. Staff note that the applicant is proceeding in the normal order of approval codified in section 27-270 of the prior zoning ordinance. In accordance with this section, I'll repeat my sentence.
You can keep going, Ms. Gupta.
Yes, sir. Staff note that the applicant is proceeding in the normal order of approval codified in section 27-270 of the prior zoning ordinance. In accordance with this section, and as the next step, the applicant has filed a detailed site plan application for the site for a private school, which has not yet been accepted. This application will be reviewed by the urban design section, and the applicant will need to make their case that the proposed use is permitted on the subject site and meets the criteria of a private school listed in section 27-443 of the prior zoning ordinance. In the event that the applicant cannot demonstrate conformance with these criteria, the applicant will need to file a special exception to permit the specific proposed use on the property per section 27-441 of the prior zoning ordinance. At this time, the staff report references a detailed site plan as the next approval required for the development of the subject property. Staff recommends an additional condition in the event that a special exception is needed for the proposed use. The findings and conditions of approval of this preliminary plan will still apply to a special exception site plan. If permitted by the board, staff will read this new condition 14 into the record. Next slide, please. The applicant has also requested revision to recommended condition 13, which relates to any additional easement required to provide access to the subject site. The applicant requests and the staff is agreeable to the addition of the phrase "if necessary" at the end of the first sentence of the condition. And if it pleases the board, I will read the revised condition 13 also into record.
Please.
I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
Okay, so the revised condition 13 will read, prior to approval of a final plat of subdivision, the applicant and the applicant's heirs, successors, and/or assignees shall enter into a new or amended access easement agreement with the adjoining property owner to accommodate the entirety of the driveways and sidewalks located off-site, which provide access to the subject property, if necessary. The easement agreement shall be reviewed and approved by the Development Review Division of the Prince George's County Planning Department, recorded in land records, and the LIBOR folio shown on the final plat prior to recordation. The final plat shall reflect the location and extent of the easement. And the new condition 14 will read, the findings and conditions included herein relevant to a detailed site plan shall apply to a special exception site plan, should one be required. In conclusion, staff recommends that the planning board adopt the findings and approve the preliminary plan of subdivision 4-21047, type 1 tree conservation plan TCP 1-008-2022, as well as variance to section 25-122B1G, subject to the conditions found on pages 21 through 23 of the staff report, as revised by applicant's exhibit 1 to condition 12B, the revised condition 13 as read into the record, and the new condition 14 as also read into the record. This concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta. Commissioners, you've heard from staff. Are there any questions for staff or Ms. Gupta or any other members of staff at this point before we turn to the applicant?
I have none.
Okay, no questions. Thank you. I'm sure we'll be coming back to you at some point. So let me, before I turn to Mr. Taub, I just want to check on the status of our opponent situation. Mr. Baumgartner, are you on the line?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Derek Baumgartner.
Thank you, Mr. Baumgartner. So you are the attorney for the Fairwood Community Association. After the applicant speaks, I'll turn to you first. And then I have some other members who are listed as opponents as well. I just want to see who's here. Is Tamla Kirkland here?
I am.
Thank you. And Ms. Jill Oliver.
Yes, I am.
And Mr. Jonathan Brown. Ms. Tamika Washington. Mr. Mallory, Eugene Mallory.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. And Ms. Colette Harris.
Here.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in opposition to this who's not on this list, but who may have signed up previously, who's authorized to speak? Did I miss anyone in this? Is the short answer to that? From the opponent side. Okay. All right. So when it comes to the opposition, Mr. Baumgartner, I'll start with you, and I'll work with you to see how much time you need, and then other individuals will have 3 minutes to speak. But now let me turn back to the applicant, Mr. Taub, if you can introduce your team and manage the time as you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the board, good morning. For the record, I'm Larry Taub, attorney with the firm of O'Malley, Miles, Niland, and Gilmore in Greenbelt. Very pleased to be here before you this morning. Yes, I would like to introduce my team. I have here with me today, virtually anyway, my client, Ms. Anna Bernanke. We have our site and landscape planners, Sharon Bradley and Bill St. John Day, our transportation planner, Mr. Osborne George from OR George and Associates, and our archaeological consultant, Mr. Matthew Pallas from the Ottery Group. We appreciate all their work on this matter. First of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Gupta very much and the staff for working with us on this matter. This is somewhat complicated, but they've done a great job and very thorough as usual, and we greatly appreciate their assistance. They've been great to work with. I must first state that the applicant does accept the staff recommendation and all the conditions therein as amended, as proposed to be amended per Ms. Gupta's statements. That would be amendments to conditions 12B and 13. And we do accept the new condition 14 as well. These conditions really have to do more with the fact that we still need to do more engineering on the site. That's really why we're requesting those very minor proposed amendments to conditions. I first want to give you some background on the subject property itself, that is Fairview. As you know from the staff report, this is one of the oldest historic sites in Prince George's County. The staff report indicates that it has been at this location since 1800, and therefore it has been in existence well before the Fairwood community was developed. When the Fairwood community was developed around the Fairview historic site, as part of its development plan and as actually implemented, it caused a situation whereby Fairview, this particular property, was landlocked. It was entirely surrounded by homeowners association common area, which is why at the time that was done, the developers of Fairwood created the two 22-foot wide easements for ingress and egress, as was noted by Ms. Gupta. So this is a situation that came about because of the creation of the Fairwood community adjacent to it. I think it's also important to state, and I'm basing my statements here to a degree on the fact that I've read through the statements of some of the opponents that were in the record. And I think it's important to understand several things. Number one, the fact that a private school is permitted by right on property of 5 acres or more has been a use that has been in existence for decades, and is not something that was done especially for this property in any way. This has been there, and it is simply a fact that it is a use that is permitted by right upon this property as zoned. I think it's also important to understand here that my client is very sensitive to the fact that this property is located within the Fairwood neighborhood. Her sensitivity to this is being demonstrated in, as you will see in future applications, in her design of the buildings that will be proposed on this property. That will, of course, come to you at the detailed site plan stage. But more to the point with regard to this particular application, my client, from the very, very beginning, in the early days, and that is beginning in October of 2020, met voluntarily with the Fairwood Homeowners Association. There was a total, including the last meeting we had, which was just 2 weeks ago, we've had a total of 7 meetings, several with the board, at least 2, maybe 3, I can't recall exactly, with membership, with the general membership. Certainly the last meeting we had 2 weeks ago was with the general membership. That was a meeting that lasted almost 3 hours. And we've done this, as you can see, this application was accepted in March of this year, March of 2022, March 17, 2022, which means, number one, as Ms. Gupta correctly stated, that we are subject to the prior zoning ordinance. But what it also shows is that we began meeting with the community a year and a half, almost a year and a half before the application was submitted and accepted. I think that's an important point. Now, I think one of the, again, in looking at the concerns as expressed in some of the emails I saw that were placed in the record, I think it's important to note here that there seemed to be a number of the emails that came in referenced the belief that this particular school would not be open to residents of Fairwood, that it's going to be some sort of a restricted school of sorts. And that is not in any way the case. In fact, at the last meeting with the residents, my client actually put forward a proposal that would give it priority for at least 25% of the maximum enrollment for each year to be allowed to be occupied by Fairwood residents. My client would welcome residents from the Fairwood community to come to this school. And I think that she also indicated at that same meeting that not only would students be welcome as students at the school, children would be welcome as students of the school, but that the residents could also take advantage, should there be, as she proposes, any after-school programs, any spring break, winter break, or summer programs as well. They would be welcome to come to this program.
Mr. Chow, let me jump in for a second. So most of what you're talking about here really is not related to what's before us in the preliminary plan subdivision. I'll give you a little latitude on this, but I'm going to say the same thing to Mr. Baumgartner as well when the time comes, which is I want you to focus on what is before us at this stage of approval, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll be glad to do so. I'll just summarize that by saying that I thought that was important to say just because there is so much of a theme of that going forward in some of the emails in the record. But beyond that, I would state that the other concerns I noted are very much issues that would be raised at the detailed site plan stage and not issues that would be raised at the preliminary plan stage. They all will be addressed and will be continued to work with the HOA on that. Now, I think with regard to, I would like to state that with regard to Mr. Baumgartner's appeal, I think, first of all, I think it's important to state that it is our belief that my client's proposal will absolutely meet the definition of a private school in the zoning ordinance, and we totally agree with any suggestion to the contrary. But as to Mr. Baumgartner's appeal, I just want to state that I reviewed section 27-229 of the county code, and I don't believe that the Board of Appeals, to whom that appeal was addressed, has the statutory authority to hear this appeal. I believe that should this be an issue at all, it's a matter which should be addressed to the planning board and not to the Board of Appeals. I think that it is my contention here that any issue with regard to whether or not this is a private school is not in fact before the board at this stage for this application. As you all well understand, a preliminary plan of subdivision evaluates the adequacy of public facilities. The only specificity that was given in this application for the proposed school is that it will have a maximum capacity of 80 students. And that was given so that the transportation evaluation can be properly done based on that, and we understand that. So with that, we would suggest that in fact, I would say that I would emphasize the fact that if you look at condition number 3, in this case, that relates, it's a very common condition in many subdivisions. It says total development within the subject property shall be limited to uses which generate no more than 56 a.m. peak hour trips and 10 p.m. peak hour vehicle trips. It's not specific to the particular use that we are proposing at this point in time. That will come at the detailed site plan. It is at that stage that we will propose the specifics of the school, the buildings, open space, operational issues, things of that nature. So with that, I would thank you again and thank Ms. Gupta again for your attention. We certainly do agree with the staff recommendation. As I said, all the conditions as proposed to be amended, and we would respectfully request your approval. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Taub. Commissioners, questions for the applicant, for Mr. Taub or other members of his team for this preliminary plan subdivision?
None.
Okay, no questions. Thank you, Mr. Taub. Appreciate it. So let us turn to the opposition. Again, I'm going to start with Mr. Baumgartner, who's the attorney for Fairwood Community Association. Just give me a sense of how much time you think you need, Mr. Baumgartner.
Yes, sir. My presentation will be brief. There are elements of the various reviews by county agencies that I did want to raise. I would say no more than 10 minutes total for my remarks moving forward.
Okay, so we'll put 10 minutes on the clock just so we can both manage the time. If you need a little bit more, that's certainly understandable.
Thank you, sir.
Take it away.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. For the record, my name is Derek Baumgartner from the law firm of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston. I do represent the Fairwood Community Association. As Mr. Taub had indicated, the Community Association is opposed to the development of Chance Academy on this property. The Fairwood community consists of about 1,800 homes that was developed in the early 2000s. And it's mostly single family detached housing. There is some townhouse development as well, but it is primarily residential in nature. I agree with Mr. Taub that and the chairman that our appeal to the Board of Appeals is certainly not before this body. However, I did want to submit it to the board, and I did want to make a couple of brief remarks about why we filed it with the board and why we filed it when we filed it. So essentially, many of the reports that are in this record, I'm going through my notes and I see whether it's the traffic report or the transportation statement, both from the park and planning staff report as well as from the applicant's consultant, fire and EMS, water and sewer, environmental, and the Historic Preservation Commission. They all presume and their findings and the reports are based on the fact that this property will be approved as a private school. I wanted to file this appeal with the Board of Appeals to establish whether in fact Chance Academy's use of the property does constitute a private school, because all of these things moving forward depend upon that fact. We certainly could have waited until the detailed site plan stage. We could wait until permits are issued, or when shovels are on the ground, or when a use and occupancy permit is requested or issued. Some attorneys might do that. Personally, that's not how I practice, because I believe that these issues should be raised early and should be addressed early. I don't think it's fair to surprise the applicant with that months down the road, and I don't think it's fair for the community to not be able to voice those concerns early and potentially have those concerns addressed at the very beginning stage of this process. So I did want to note that for the record. I'm happy to go into more detail with regards to that appeal, our contention with regard to Chance Academy, but I will certainly follow the chairman's suggestion and recommendation that we not do a deep dive into that issue, as it's not expressly before the planning board here this morning.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I do want to briefly go through the various agency reports and the APF finding that this board is required to provide in order for this application to move forward. Many of these will certainly be addressed, or should be addressed at the detailed site plan stage. But at least at this point, the community is not satisfied with the information that's been provided, that adequate public facilities are being provided or can be provided at the site. Starting with traffic and transportation, as the materials show, this particular site is bounded on all sides by a primarily residential community. It is a stone's throw away from Route 50. It is equidistant between the District of Columbia and Annapolis. And what we're looking in terms of traffic and transportation, there are several adjustments that were made in Mr. George's report that echoed in the staff report that we questioned. Number one, there's a 15% adjustment for bus and carpooling. And number two, there's a 10% adjustment for a homeschooling option. Now, both of those adjustments take that traffic count or vehicle number down, where there does not seem to be a reliable effect upon that. And what I mean by that is that our understanding is that Chance Academy will not have what's traditionally referred to as a school bus. It'll be some smaller version of that, whether that's a 15-passenger van or some other vehicle. We are not aware. We're not sure where that 15% adjustment came from. Is that an adjustment that's required in the metrics? Is that an adjustment based upon Chance Academy's intended use of busing or carpooling? So that is a question. Second question is the 10% adjustment for a homeschooling option. So for purposes of today, if we take it that Chance Academy is in fact a school by their own documents and statements and presentations, it is a school for children who are homeschooled, mostly in Prince George's County. So the community is a bit confused as to how you get a credit for a homeschooling option for a school that is entirely based upon children who are in fact homeschooled. So both that 15% adjustment for the bus and carpooling and the 10% adjustment for the homeschooling option bring those vehicle trips down to where the community does not feel that that is an accurate representation for traffic counts and the under the trip generation manual. Further, this property is located along Fairview Vista, which is currently on your screen. Fairview Vista runs generally north-south. It is a 2-lane road, 1 lane both directions. there is one primary access point to the site. The traffic report does not go into enough detail, I believe, to show that there will be no queuing on Fairview Vista, especially with cars traveling north and making a left into the site. That has not been adequately mitigated or addressed. And I do not believe that that intersection will be signalized, further making that potentially harmful to the surrounding community and not satisfying the adequate public facilities finding for traffic and transportation. I would also add that this on all four sides, most of the intersections are unsignalized, I believe, which can make traffic and congestion very difficult. Reviewing the property from an aerial view, can't quite see it on your screen right now, but there are no crosswalks on Fairview Vista Drive that I'm aware of. So there will be no way for residents on the west side of the property, I'm sorry, on the east side of the property to access the site for their children or for events or whatever it might be. The traffic report and the numbers, just to go back to that very briefly, there is a discrepancy between the trip generation numbers and the staff report and those provided by the traffic consultant, Mr. George. So the community was confused and unclear as to why there were different numbers provided under those two traffic analyses. I would note that the traffic report also goes into the level of service for the intersections and including background development. The A and B levels, some of them go down to a C level at the end of the construction phase, including all the background development that's scheduled to come online over the next several years. Moving on, I'm trying to be brief, Mr. Chairman. For police and fire access, the staff report does mention that fire and EMS access to the site does not meet the current standard. There's a discrepancy in the report between a 4-minute response time and a 5-minute response time. The condition that Chance Academy would coordinate with Prince George's County Fire to somehow address that with another plan, to me, is not sufficient. That does not meet the adequate public facilities standard of current conditions being acceptable or the ability to make that condition acceptable. I would also note that for police response, the closest police station, according to Google Maps, is a 14-minute drive away. That is assuming there's no traffic, which we understand is almost never the case. So if we add time to that 14-minute time period, even for police and emergency response, that is also insufficient and does not meet the adequate public facilities standard. It's unfortunate that we have to address police response to a school, but given the age that we live in, that is something that is very concerning, that a police response would take that long to arrive at the school. For water and sewer, it's our understanding that the property is currently served by private water and sewer. That's interesting given the development of the entire Fairwood site as residential housing, and that there will be a need to now put that site on public water and sewer. We understand that the property is currently categorized as category 4, and that will need to go to a category 3. The staff report and the plans submitted by the applicant do not go into sufficient detail, we believe, into how that is going to take place. What will be the category 3 modifications that will get that property to that point. From the environmental side, there's a variance requested for the removal of 2 specimen trees. The staff report indicates that the variance, that the property and the development meets those variance standards. We contend that it does not, specifically item A and item D. Item A refers to special conditions peculiar to the property have caused the unwarranted hardship. That's our contention that the unwarranted hardship is, in this instance, caused by the action of the applicant. Those trees are in a ingress-egress point, and they wish to remove them. There are many other points on that property that ingress-egress point could be moved to allow for those trees to remain. And secondly, element D, that the request is not based on conditions or circumstances which are the result of the actions by the applicant. This particular application requests an institutional use of private school. I would offer to you that those specimen trees could remain in place if the property was developed in any other numerous ways that would not require their removal. So lastly, I want to touch very briefly on the site as a locally designated historic site. As Mr. Tal articulated correctly, this property has been an historic site, and current Fairview Mansion has been an historic building for a very long time. And when they were conducting preliminary tests, they did shovel pit tests, which is essentially 178 small holes in the ground. And they found nearly 215 artifacts were recovered from the phase 1 survey. The archaeological consultant stated in his report that the cultural deposits identified have the potential to yield significant cultural data regarding the development of the plantation core over time and history of African Americans pre and post emancipation who worked on the property. It's the community's belief that disturbing site in the way that's been proposed, not merely repurposing the Fairview Mansion, but instead building multiple buildings, an amphitheater, parking lots, and other development on the site would disturb those resources that have been in place and are worthy of study and are worthy of analysis. I do understand that the archaeological aspects of this will be addressed later on, but I do find that or I believe that what's been presented, even at preliminary plan, is not yet sufficient to meet those standards. Mr. Chairman, I will stop my comments there. I'm happy to address any of those issues in more detail. I'm happy to address our challenge of the use of the property. I would just lastly note in that regard that it's important for everyone to know moving forward if a county agency, if Park and Planning, if DPI, if the Board of Appeals, if they designate this use as not being a private school, everything from now until that point will be for naught. All of the time, all of the resources, all of the meetings, all of the hearings. And so we would request that the Planning Board hold this preliminary plan review pending a determination that Chance Academy is a private school before moving forward through all those steps and potentially wasting both the applicant's time, the applicant's money, and the community's time and resources in really looking after their community to ensure that their investment in their homes is protected. And with that, I will close. And again, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you or members of the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Baumgartner. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Baumgartner? And then before I turn to other members who are going to be speaking in opposition as well. Shabila, you're on mute.
Simply said, I have no questions at this time. Thank you.
No questions at this time.
I have one question, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, I'd like to know what is the dispute as to whether or not this is a private school or not? I guess I'm still confused with that. I've read the backup material, but it's not clear to me.
I can ask that, Mr. Chairman, or if you wish.
Ms. Bagg, why don't you go ahead and answer?
So just very briefly, there are a couple different levels to that question, Commissioner. First, under the Prince George's County zoning ordinance, there is a definition of private school. We don't believe that Chance Academy meets that definition of a private school at a very base level. Beyond that, private schools are essentially bifurcated in the zoning ordinance to be private schools by right, which our understanding is that that is what is being proposed under this application, and then private schools by special exception. And under that criteria, that private school either has to be accredited by the state of Maryland or has to meet certain other standards to be a school. And the community simply feels that, as well-meaning as Ms. Bernanke and this application are, and we do not challenge that at all, as well-meaning as the intention here that the proposed use of the property simply does not meet the zoning limits. Our understanding is that Chance Academy is an institution for homeschool children, that children who are under a proper homeschool plan of compliance with whatever county or the District of Columbia, they have to meet certain standards, and that they come to Chance Academy for certain classes. There's a part-time option, there's a full-time option, and the community does not believe that that operation constitutes a private school. It may constitute a community center, it may constitute some service, it may constitute a philanthropic institution, but that simply does not constitute a private school.
Okay, I understand it now. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Other questions? If not, I'm going to turn to other speakers. I'll go through the list that I have in the order that I have. Again, I'll put 3 minutes on the clock for each of you. You can take up to that amount of time. And I'll start with Ms. Kirkland.
Good morning, and I will try to run through this as quickly as I can. I want to start by saying can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you fine. And I said, take your time. You have 3 minutes.
I want to make sure that there is consideration that the Fairwood Community Master Plan was specifically planned and designed in sections for various uses. And there are sections designed for commercial and institutional use, but the roads and infrastructure at this particular section of the community was designed and planned solely for detached single-family dwellings, including the subject site, which is the center anchor residential site for these neighborhoods of homes. I mean, the carefully designed Fairwood Community Master Plan was approved by the council, your staff, and this board, and it seems to be overlooked and is now being severely compromised. And I know the zoning does allow school use. However, the applicant is not a school. Though its activities include an educational components, its services also include consulting, fundraising, community services, and teaming with other organizations, a sort of global hub, and developing or delivering its services to clients, including businesses, public agencies, religious organizations. I mean, the client stated, or the applicant stated in a recent community presentation, that it may also authorize other organizations to use the buildings and the grounds or facilities for rent or fees. Perhaps this company would be considered a multi-purpose community organization, but it is not a school. And the public believes that this board has or should have a responsibility to ensure that an applicant be eligible before the board proceeds with spending time and tax dollars considering an ineligible application. This applicant is not eligible. But in case the board does decide to proceed with this application, now that it knows that this applicant is not a school, I request that there be a condition that, if approved, no other uses be allowed, and no other activities except for the benefit of the Fairwood community that the applicant and the community agree upon. I would ask for a bit more time because I want to address parking and traffic quickly. And what I will say to that is that for this and similarly projects, a key and critical consideration should be parking. And I didn't find it in any of the reports. The impact of commercial and institutional parking can be devastating for neighborhood where they're in this case solely homes. The operations, activities, and events of a school, in this case a multi-purpose community center, can bring hundreds of vehicles. If we were to just consider if this were a school and you have 80 students, events that would bring the families of those 80 students, contractors, vendors, guests. 32 parking spaces that are proposed is woefully inadequate. And there's no reasonable way that you're not going to have parking flood these neighborhoods by the applicant saying we'll find other space on the site. That won't happen. And then lastly, I would say with the traffic study, which I think is just so inadequate, I think the board should require traffic studies for schools to include not just school bus traffic, but staff, contractors, a percentage of students who may drive. At this particular, or I should say, a particular concern is Fairview Vista Drive. It's a single lane each way. I suggest a turn lane would be necessary between My Molly's Drive and Goodlow's Promise Drive to help mitigate congestion and safety issues that would occur as a result of frequent turns. Already at
Let me ask you to wrap it up.
Okay, already at Goodlow's Promise Drive, that it's a curvy section of the road. There's many school bus stops, parents park there, there's bike traffic, there's not a three-way stop sign, there's pedestrians. I don't think this area between My Molly's Drive and Goodlow's Promise has been adequately addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time and your comments. Let me turn now to the next person on my list. I have a Jill Oliver.
Hi, I'm Jill Oliver. Good morning, Mr.
Morning, Ms.
Chairman.
Oliver.
And
you have 3 minutes on the clock, and the time is yours.
okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I am one of the affected community members, and I happen to be the vice president of the Fairwood Community Association. I am here in opposition because of three reasons that some have already touched on. Number one, as our lawyer stated, we don't believe that Chance Academy is an actual school, private school, and we believe it doesn't support the zoning requirement that defines what a school is. And secondly, we believe that the current structure of the school does not support the master plan. And lastly, we also believe that this violates the community's trust if this moves forward. And just to give you some context as to why I say that, is that when Fairwood Community was built in the early 2000s, and the community was promised a public school, a middle school for children that was supposed to be accredited. That never happened. So many of the community members bought into Fairwood expecting to get that. And at the end of the day, many of them, their children were little when they invested in Fairwood, and their children are now grown and gone, and they never got the school that they expected to get. Now, fast forward, we have this so-called school that has come out for an application that it has been speedily approved through the Prince George's County Council. Now application has been submitted, and it doesn't support the requirements or definition of what a public school is and what was already defined in the master plan. that Fairwood residents bought into, wanted, not only for Fairwood residents, but the surrounding community. My question is, whose responsibility is it to validate applicants, what an applicant says before we start this process? As our attorney said, a lot of resources have been spent already by Fairwood, our residents, and you to review an application that does not fit the definition of what a private school is supposed to be in Prince George's County. And for that reason, we want you to deny this application. And if I can get a few more seconds to also address two issues that came up. One is Ms. Gupta talked about going through and defining, once it's defined whether it meets the standard or not of a private school, that they would, if it doesn't, that Chance Academy could pursue a special exception, which that's their right. But I challenge the fact that they should pursue an exception under the prior zoning requirement, because from the very beginning, they have a sophisticated counsel. They knew they didn't, in reviewing the zoning requirement, they never met the private school requirement. So if that is to be pursued, they should pursue it under the current zoning regulations. They were changed for a reason, because communities were not advised properly and were not given the opportunity for public hearing prior to the text amendment. Lastly, I wanted to ask the question around additional easements that would be required by Fairwood. I did hear that there was some discussion around that review would occur separately. And I want to know, is the request by the applicant to require an easement as part of this process without due process for the Fairwood community? And with that, those are my comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver. We next have Mr. Jonathan Brown. Mr. Brown on the line. If not, if I miss him and he comes back, he'll get a chance to speak. Next, we have Ms. Tamika Washington. Same thing. You'll have a chance to come back in a few minutes if I miss you. Next, we have Mr. Eugene Mallory.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I hope you bear with me. I'm vision impaired, and it took me many hours to present or at least to write the words I'd like to speak to you today. So I hope you bear with me as I try to read my screen.
Yes, sir.
First of all,
Mr. Mallory, let me just say, be respectful. First of all, I appreciate you taking the time and the effort to be before us. It's always helpful. So you have 3 minutes on the clock, and I'll certainly give you a little bit of a leeway and latitude with that, as well as I have with other folks. But that's the frame that you're working with, and take it away. The time is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for bringing me to Fairwood. The master plan, we searched for years and years, and we decided that Fairwood was the place. It's the masterful design. And that design did not anticipate what is happening today. And I like to correct the record for Mr. Tout, who is quoted as saying that if it were not for this text amendment, he would not be going forward. And that's on record. So with that, I'd like to get into my written statement and say that I'm here to talk about the Chance's traffic study and its relationship, schools, and easements. Before I do, though, I'd like to briefly comment on the staff report, which has some glaring inconsistencies. The staff report refers to a prior RE zone in the current R-E zone. And to the novice, that seems to be very confusing. And it should be explained somewhere what the difference is. But it goes on to equate, which was even more confusing, an R-E zone with a multiple use facility. And trying to understand why that equation was set, I looked at the staff report in section 24-128 B2B, which was added to section to the text amendment 24-128. Now that wording specifically allows a private right-of-way easement in the mixed-use community zone to a private school in a historic site designated R-E. So it seems to me that's the connection between the equation between R-E and a mixed site. Now, if this reference to an undefined, unaccredited, unregulated private school on a historic site is not a classic of an arbitrary and capricious ruling, then it'd be a stretch to find one. It appears that the interpretation of the ruling is as arbitrary as the ruling itself, since a school does not currently exist on a historic site. So to debate something that doesn't exist seems to be not reasonable. Because certainly if you give an applicant a chance to go back and meet the qualifications of the school, they can do that. I don't think the law is meant to do that. If there's a school on the site, and if it meets the requirement, then I think it should then be considered. Now, let me just go forward a little further. What the city council did was to remove the specific line of text in subdivision section 24-128, which is strictly prohibited the chance of cabinet. So again, Mr. Taub said that, oh, this is a normal. I think I understand to say that we could normally go forward. But again, this section 24-128 strictly prohibited chance application for moving forward. And they inserted a line of text which uniquely and specifically allows chance to move forward. Chance created an inescapable catch-22 problem while trying to conform to the traffic staff report. Either its expansive site plan is grossly over-designed for a small student population, or chance anticipates much more than a relative few cars coming in and out of the chance compound. Since a private road already exists between the property located at 4600 Fairway Vista Drive, the compound, and the public road with the same name, the easements are not necessary and should be terminated if already granted, or not removed, or otherwise not granted, because for several reasons. A, the easements are unreasonable burden on Fairwood. Second, there exists a private road that practicable means of ingress and egress. 3, the two easements are on the property that is owned by the Fairwood Homeowners Community or Association. And I'd like to add a note to that. There's an adverse condition, that adverse possession here, because approximately 20 years ago, the Fairwood community was built around the historic site on the understanding that it would be able to develop it as it has. So the site has been developed and used with the understanding that we would be allowed to keep that in the condition that we develop it to. The Planning Commission should request a new comprehensive traffic study. But by only relying on the inadequate chance study, it runs the risk of creating a serious traffic problem, not only on Fairway Vista Road, but backing up traffic into 450 and Church Road. The impact of adding, excuse me, the impact of adding an opportunistic four lanes of traffic into Fairview Vista Drive would create a safety risk only mitigated by installing traffic lights, which would add to the traffic backup. These two additional intersections, or one four-lane intersection, would be larger than any in Fairwood, and it would be similar to the intersection at Fairview Vista and Church Road, where a young child was killed because there was not a traffic light, which in essence is saying that looking in the future, in the near future, there would be requirement for a traffic light, which would totally cause problems in Fairwood, as Fairwood Vista is a major road that with ingress and egress to the subdivisions without stoplights. Before the planning commission,
let me ask you to wrap it up.
2 seconds. I got a minute. I'm going to wrap it up right now. Before the planning commission accepts the staff report and approves the chance application, it should consider the unintended consequences to Prince George's County at large, as this action would open a door for any developer who chooses to put a school in its request for a zone change. If this application for a school disguised as an undefined institution should not have, pardon me, my eyes are going, should not have been exempt from institutional development because it will generate new students per section 24-122.02, page 10. And in the staff report, and therefore the application should be denied. Lastly, the chance traffic study is incomplete and wholly inadequate because it's based only on vehicles carrying the students. The traffic study does not include vehicles of parents, visitors, teachers, staff, janitorial staff, ground staff, security, etc. And Chance's global initiative with its partners would generate much more traffic than has been anticipated to date. Right?
Thank you.
I lost my conclusion. Give me 1 second. According to the staff report, page 21, any development generally generating an impact greater than that identified here and above shall require a new preliminary plan of subdivision with a new determination of the agenda. And thank you so much. I have more, but my eyes are failing me and I can't locate it quickly. May I say something in summary? Again, yes, I'd like to thank the commission for bringing me here to Fairwood. You did a masterful job on this master plan. And I hope you stay consistent with that master plan, because something like this will destroy this community, which is rated as one of the highest, highly regarded communities in Prince George. It has attracted well-educated, successful people. And by approving this plan, it will have the reverse effect. It will have these people leaving this community to find another community in another county. And with that, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mallard. Thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks. We have Ms. Colette Harris. Are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and same thing, I'll ask you to be mindful of the time. So let me give you 3 minutes and the clock starts, and take it away. The time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and planning board members. I just want to take the opportunity to say that first and foremost that my husband and I concur with the previous speakers and points made in opposition to this application. We just want to assert for the record that the scale of this project is extensive. It will alter the existing character and beauty of Fairwood. It will negatively affect the neighborhood's property values and will pose a threat to the health and safety of residents and the history of our community. We implore you to please vote no on Chance Manor LLC's preliminary plan of subdivision. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present our points of opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Thank you kindly. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in opposition to this preliminary plan of subdivision? Okay, thank you all. Thank you all very much. So commissioners, do you have questions for any of these speakers of the opponents? That would be a little bit for Mr. Baumgardner, but as well as any of the other folks who spoke. Any questions?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions in particular, but I did write down a lot of notes, some of which seem to be thematic that I would really appreciate Mr. Taub and, if and as appropriate, our council commenting on. But the Fairview Master Plan was brought up a couple of times by some of the speakers, and in the context of being non-conforming. I think everyone mentioned the traffic analysis not being adequate or traffic study, the definition of school, because that's how that's the institutional use through which we are vetting the report. And then Mr. Mallory talked about the zone being confusing, and perhaps if staff could weigh in on that. So those were just some of the themes that I heard, and I would appreciate a response to, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I would concur with Commissioner Washington, and I also have a concern about what's going to happen to the historic nature of this property. This is a significant piece of historical value for the county. I understand that it was owned once by Mr. Bowie himself, and it was a slave encampment. And I don't know if what's going to be put on this property would be reflective of that history. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. So I'm with you that what the speakers in opposition have figured is more questions for staff and for the applicant. So if there's no other questions for the opposition, why don't we turn back to staff and see if we have questions for staff based on what we heard from the applicants. Commissioner Washington, Commissioner Giraldo teed off some of those. Some of these might be, I believe Mr. Berger is with us as well. So I know there were some questions about the historic nature of it and what's relevant to at this level, this preliminary subdivision. It would be helpful to hear. There were a number of questions around transportation, but perhaps Mr. Capers could help us with that. The issues related to use are not relevant to what's before us at the preliminary subdivision stage. So I don't think we really need to hear much more about that. But there was a lot about trip count and parking and what's counted and what's not counted that I think it would be beneficial for us to hear. The issue about Commissioner Giraldo, you mentioned around the zoning. Mr. Mallory brought it up around the confusing zoning, or perhaps Commissioner Washington, you did. But Ms. Oliver also brought it up related to old versus new. I think that we know that that's a choice that the applicant has, but it'd be helpful to talk about that a bit for the folks we have who are listening. So perhaps we could start with staff to address some of these questions. And Mr. Goldsmith, I don't know, weigh in as you feel like you want to weigh in. So let me turn it over in terms of order. Perhaps we start with trip count and traffic. Perhaps we start with Mr. Capers.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the planning board. My name is Will Capers. I'm the supervisor with the transportation planning section. I took several notes regarding concerns regarding the traffic study, and I will go down my list and we'll open it up to the board to ask additional questions if necessary. There was a concern that was brought up regarding the adjustment factors that were used to reduce the baseline trips, especially in regard to trips that will be reduced based on bus service and also based on homeschooling option. The transportation review guidelines is what we use to set parameters for traffic studies. The TRG allows the applicant to use adjustment factors to reduce baseline trips with adequate justification. The applicant provided justification to use these reductions based on their current school operations and other schools that they currently operate. We don't question the business model for an applicant's proposal, but we do verify the justification, and we found that the justification for the bus service and also for the homeschooling was adequate based on their current school operation and also other schools that they operate. In regards to the traffic study based on student generation, that is not completely accurate. The rates that were approved by staff during the scoping of the traffic study is based on the IT rates, which encompass all trips that are generated by a school during the peak period. Yes, the students was used as the independent variable to assess the generated trips, which is the standard and best practice that has been used in other school uses in the county and also the national best practice. However, the rates incorporate all trips generated by the site during the peak period, which includes any trips for deliveries, for visitors, so forth and so on. So it is evaluated based on student population, but it incorporates and it evaluates all trips generated by the site to serve a student, to serve a school with that density. The last question that I have regarding the traffic analysis was the operations of trips that were assigned to Fairview Vista Drive. I think concern about queuing was brought up. We did look at several intersections along Vista Drive, and the opposition was accurate that these intersections are unsignalized. Our standard for evaluating adequacy for unsignalized intersection, unsignalized intersection is considered inadequate if it has a delay of more than 50 seconds. The traffic study shows that none of these unsignalized intersections had a delay over 15 seconds. I think 15.6 seconds was the highest delay for any of the unsignalized intersections. So it indicates to us that with the traffic added by the development, that there would be adequate gaps to allow vehicles to process through these unsignalized intersections adequately. The last comment that I have is regarding parking. Just want to remind the board that parking is a requirement that will be evaluated as part of the detailed site plan process, where the applicant would have to adhere to the parking standards based on the zoning requirements. We did recommend as a condition of approval a circulation plan to help facilitate that evaluation at that time. And that's all I have on my notes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Capers. Quite thorough. Before we turn to other staff, let me ask commissioners, do you have any other questions for Mr. Capers? Anything else that you picked up from the opposition or from the applicant that would be helpful to ask Mr. Capers?
I don't. I would just thank Mr. Capers.
I have one for Mr. Capers. Thank you. I guess my question deals with you're basing it based upon other schools that Chance has. Is that what I heard? Or
yes, the reduction that was used to reduce baseline trips. I think the opposition brought up that yes, we accepted reduction factors for bus service and also for homeschooling, but this was based on the business model and justification that was provided based on the applicants on current school that's being operated in other schools that they currently operate, which we found acceptable.
Okay, did you consider the fact that the proposed school campus will include 5 additional buildings? Because that's under item 11, historic. So I was wondering when you did the traffic study, whether or not you took that into account.
Again, the traffic study assumes the generation of the 80 students population, not the buildings. Again, not using buildings as a measure of evaluating trip generation is not within best practices. We always evaluate students since the students drive the operation of the school. So we do not consider the buildings. We assume that the students will be distributed over to the 85 buildings, which is consistent with best practices and which was used with trip generations for other applications in the county.
So you're basing this on the assumption that there will only be 80 students and that there will not be other activities in which more than 80 students or 80 persons will come to the site. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we are using the guidance from the Institution of Transportation Engineers, which requires that we use the student population to evaluate peak period trips. If there are activities that are outside of the school, that's outside of the peak period, which is not a consideration with the transportation review guidelines, which we use to evaluate traffic studies.
Right, but if they're within the peak times, you can't consider them because the application simply says we're going to have 80 students and that's it. That's
not correct. That's not correct. We considered the rate that was used for the peak period, which is the rate that was used in this study for the 80 students. That is the guidance that we will have to consider based on the trip generation formula to evaluate peak period trips.
And Mr. Capers, if I may, I think what my colleague is getting at and what I thought I heard you say is that your analysis does incorporate or all contemplated visitors during those peak periods. I think that's what Commissioner Giraldo is really getting at. Am I correct?
That is correct, Commissioner Washington. It incorporates all trips that are generated during the peak period.
Right, which may include students as well as other types of traffic, correct?
That is correct. That is correct, Commissioner Washington.
Okay, thank you. I'm just concerned about this area. I don't live there, but I'm familiar with it. And I know that traffic is horrible in that area because you're basically dealing with country roads. But anyway, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chafer.
Well, I live in this area and it's not a country road, Commissioner Giraldo. Thank you.
Well, for somebody from the city, it is.
Well, we'll leave that to staff for the formal definition of what the road is, but I appreciate the back and forth. Mr. Baumgartner, I want to give you a chance to cross-examine the testimony that we're going to have from staff as well. So briefly, if you have any questions for Mr. Capers, now would be the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I certainly understand that the ICE trip manual, it's a book that's put out there. There are facts and figures that are put out there. But my questions to Mr. Capers go towards, yes, and the proposed school with 80 students, that's what's factored in here. But there's no, I don't believe, and I guess I'll phrase it as a question, Mr. Capers, is there any way to really know the total number of actual trips that will come into that school during any given time that would include parents, friends, events, all those sorts of things, separate and apart from the trip manual metrics?
Just so I understand your question, are you saying if there are any additional analysis that can accurately demonstrate how many trips are actually entering the site? Sorry.
Sure. So I'll clarify. You had testified that, or you had stated that the 80 number, the total number of students, 80, and under the ICE trip manual would include all other trips to the site, staff, faculty, maintenance, all those sorts of things. It's my understanding that the trip manual is not that broad, that you simply plug in the number of students and then it spits out a number. So that would not necessarily include things like multiple people coming in a car. It wouldn't necessarily.
Mr. Baumgartner, keep it as a question, please.
My apologies. Does the trip manual fully encompass all trips that would be entering a school with 80 students?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the clarification. Yeah, so again, I'll answer the question by stating two things. The transportation review guidelines is what we use as our general regulations to scope the parameters for traffic study. The guidelines indicate that we use published data from the Institutes of Transportation Engineers, where there aren't any local data or local rates in our guidelines. So the International Transportation Engineers trip generation guidelines, they generate rates based on various sites of various scales that were used around the country to determine the trip generation rate for certain land uses. In this case, they provide an average rate or regression linear rate that was used based on the data that was collected. And the data is collected based on the peak period generation. And as I mentioned before, that incorporates all traffic that is generated by the site during the peak periods, beyond just school students. The guidelines use students as an independent variable as a best practice, because the students generate the needs for such visitors, such services, and so forth and on. But I would say it's more than just simply plugging in a number and getting results. It is based on empirical data that was published with this manual.
Thank you. And lastly, with regard to the adjustment factors, you had mentioned that there were, or we'd spoken about there was an adjustment factor for bus and carpooling and for homeschooling. You had stated that those numbers and percentages were given to you by the applicant, correct?
The applicant provided justification of the programs that are used in their current operations, and we use that as their justification to assume the reductions that they propose. And we found it to be adequate.
And did the applicant explain that their requested use of the property was a private school for specifically homeschool children?
I object to that because, I mean, that really doesn't matter. It's private school is a private school. And the manner in which that occurs is based on, as Mr. Caper said, the actual experience in the current location where they are operating. The issue of whether or not homeschool is going to occur in the detailed site plan.
Right, I agree with Mr. Taub. That's really isn't what's before us. So, Ms. Baumgartner, do you have any other questions for Mr. Capers?
There was a discrepancy between the traffic counts in the ITE manual between the staff report and that presented by the traffic consultant. You have any thoughts on that discrepancy, Mr. Capers?
So I'll just need clarification. Traffic counts, they really do not have anything to do with the ITE manual. So I'm not sure of the discrepancy. Counts are taken at the intersections within the proposed study area. So I'm not sure what the discrepancy is, because I think we're talking about two separate components of the study.
My apologies. I used the wrong terminology. The applicant's traffic study on page 12 provides table 5 with weekday peak hour trip generation, which provides net trips on the bottom. The staff report on page 7 provides different numbers.
I will defer to Ms. Gupta. We provide, the transportation planning section provide referrals to subdivision staff who manages the staff report. Our referral trip generation rates is consistent with that. So I will defer to Ms. Gupta on that.
Ms. Gupta, can you give us an answer for that one to Mr. Baumgartner?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'll need to look at the consultant staff report and what is there in our staff report. I'll need some time.
Mr. Baumgartner, we'll come back to that when she's got a minute to do a little bit of research for this. And any other questions that you have for Mr. Capers?
No, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Taub, know that you're going to have an opportunity for rebuttal and close at the end of all this, right?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, so moving on from transportation, and when Ms. Gupta is ready, we'll come back to her. But moving on, the two other subjects that I have is, again, this question about old versus new zoning, and the process for additional easements may come in under that. The confusion around the zones. Perhaps Mr. Hunt do you want to take this on?
Yes, Mr. Chair, for the record, this is James Hunt with the Development Review Division. The difference between the RE versus the R-E zone is based upon the old zoning ordinance. As you can see on page, I think it was page 3 of the staff report, the R-E zone was found in the old zoning ordinance. This application was filed, if you look on the cover sheet on this staff report here, it was filed and accepted on March 17th, 2022, which is prior to the beginning of the implementation of the new zoning ordinance, which is on April 1st, 2022. Therefore, staff is indicating in here that the new zone on this property is RE. It references the old zoning ordinance designation as R-E because of the fact that within this time period, we're going to, the staff report, this application was reviewed under the old zoning ordinance. So that's the reason why it was mentioned that way in the staff report.
And of course, they have the right to do that.
Absolutely. That is the requirement because of the fact it is the old zoning ordinance and was in effect at the time of the acceptance of this staff or this application.
Okay, so turn to board members, commissioners. Any questions for Mr. Hunt related to the issue about old versus new zoning, or other questions that you heard? Clear? Mr. Baumgartner, any cross-examination for Mr. Hunt on this issue?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Gupta, are you ready yet, or still need a few minutes? No rush.
I'm trying to find the table, Mr. Baumgartner, if you can let me know which page in the traffic report. Are you looking at the traffic report submitted by the applicant and comparing it with our staff report?
That's correct, ma'am. So on the applicant staff report, it is page 12, listed as table 5. And on your staff report, it is listed on page 7, labeled as trip generation summary.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, we have our traffic consultant, Mr. George, is here today. And I will simply offer the fact that he may be able to explain whatever the perceived discrepancy may be here. If that would be helpful, he is here to testify.
I think that would be quite helpful. Let's. It's still before Ms. Gupta, unless you want to pass this on to the Mr. George. It is.
Yeah,
Yes,
I just
Mr.
wanted to
George.
clarify whether we did have a revised traffic study submitted by the applicant. So I'm not sure which traffic study Mr. Baumgartner is referring to.
Let's hear from Mr. George on behalf of the applicant, just to see if we can get some clarification on this issue. And Mr. Baumgartner, if you have additional questions, I'm happy to have you cross-examine Mr. George as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Osborne George, a professional engineer, offices in Lanham, Maryland. I would like to specifically address the question of the differences that Mr. Baumgartner cites. On page 12 of the staff report, on page 12 of the traffic study, and compare it with page 7 of this staff report, I've checked several times, Mr. Baumgartner, and I'd just like to point out that our report of the record is a revised report dated April 21, 22. And the numbers are exactly the same. The only difference is that the staff, we list the total inbound and outbound movements and then the total. And the staff report simply records the total, but the numbers add up and they are exactly the same. The difference is that the mathematical details are slightly different in that they did not include the inbound and outbound. but I've checked it several times, and the numbers are exactly, they correspond precisely.
Okay, Mr. Baumgarten, any other questions related to that?
No, sir, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. George. So, Commissioners, any other questions related to traffic? I'm sorry, we were back on zoning. There were no questions on zoning. We did the traffic. Ms. Gupta, you're okay. You're off the hook for now. The other one is related to historic preservation. And we have Mr. Berger, as well as Mr. Hunt, of course. Mr. Berger, are you on the line?
Mr. Chairman, I think he's having some technical issues, I believe.
Okay.
I saw him on early and he must have dropped off.
There were some questions that I think were relevant that would be helpful to answer on this one. So if you can figure out a way to track him down, unless you want to take this on, Ms. Gupta, Mr. Hunt, unless you want to take this on behalf of Mr. Berger, can we wait a few minutes and see if we can track him down?
Yes, sir. I'm going to try to track him down real quick.
Okay, why don't we take, folks, just so we can take a break ourselves, because we're going to be going for a little bit longer. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and we'll come back at 20 of 1, okay? So just a quick bio break, folks. We'll see you back at 20 of 1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, folks, we're back from a quick break. We're all here, commissioners, yes. Okay, so let me just recap a little bit where we are. We've had the opportunity to hear from some staff on transportation issues, on the old versus new zoning. There's a few issues that we have left before us, I believe, unless commissioners, there are other ones that you have. We'll hear from Mr. Berger to hear a bit about historic preservation and the archaeological issues, additional archaeological investigations. I want to hear from Ms. Gupta briefly around this question about the additional easements process. It's really not our process, but let's hear from staff about that specifically, just to reiterate that. And then we can end with Mr. Goldsmith, our counsel, who can talk about the question that came up related to the master plan. I imagine there's some confusion around what was presented to residents by the developer versus what's actually a formal master plan based on our rules or regs, but we'll hear from Mr. Goldsmith about that specifically. So, Mr. Berger, you are with us. We see you, and now I believe we hear you. It's good to see you and hear you.
Thank you. Good to be seen and heard.
Tracking, or do we need to recap what some of the questions are, or do you have a list of questions that you can answer to start with?
No, I think I can just jump in. I was able to hear everything. I just wasn't able to be heard when you were looking for a response, so I apologize for that.
No problem at all.
Okay. With regard to historic preservation and archaeological matters, I think I will attempt to deal with the archaeology issues first, because they seem to be a little bit more to the forefront. Unfortunately, Dr. Jennifer Stabler, the Planning Department's archaeologist, is unavailable today, so I will be wearing that hat for this purpose, although I am not by training an archaeologist. I can explain to you in a very fundamental way how the archaeological investigation process works, and that indicate that the process has already been initiated because Subtitle 27 provides for the review of archaeological impacts in the context of a preliminary plan of subdivision, which of course is the application before you. So typically an investigation starts with a phase 1, which is identified as Chairman Shapiro indicated, as a series of small holes spread across a property with a particular grid designed to come up with some statistical likelihood of findings covering a particular area. And in this case, there have been some findings with some of the test pits that have been dug, and others have not yielded anything in particular. That in and of itself, as well as the number of artifacts that may come out of a particular hole or a series of holes is not significant in isolation. So the fact that a particular test pit may include 100 artifacts and another may include none, and a third might include 1,000, is not specifically diagnostic without additional analysis. So where we are in the current process is having completed phase 1 of this entire property, based on the understanding of how the applicant, in general terms at least, would propose to use this should this and subsequent applications be approved. So Dr. Stabler has reviewed the phase 1 information, and will use that review as a way of guiding additional investigation should they be necessary based on an area that's likely to be disturbed. So for example, in a circumstance where a building is proposed to be constructed where one is currently not located, the level of investigation would necessarily be intensified based on that building location, which may include a phase 2 investigation, which is a larger sort of a meter by meter square unit that is designed to reveal more specific details than just a shovel test pit. And then, of course, depending on the result of a phase 2 analysis, depending on what is found, a decision would be made about whether to continue to investigate further or fully in the event that the location would be so disturbed in the context of new construction as to be destroyed. It would be fully investigated prior to, and as part of that ultimate destruction. Not everything goes from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, but the ordinance and standard archaeological practice does provide for that. So that's just sort of a summary way of analyzing how something could proceed to its ultimate disposition if necessary. There are circumstances, of course, where something could be unearthed that would be considered to be of such profound significance that a determination would be made that it should be retained in situ, in place, and that the location of a potential building should be adjusted to accommodate the retention of that archaeological resource that has been identified. Obviously, it's too early in the process at phase 1 to make any kind of a judgment about that because the process has to unfold in order to fully realize itself. So that's a brief explanation of archaeology. If there are any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. And I believe the applicant might actually have a consulting archaeologist on hand today to either correct or add to what I just told you.
Let me actually turn to Mr. Pallas, is that right?
Yes, it's Mr. Pallas. He's still here.
Did Mr. Berger get anything right or wrong that you want to add to?
Everything that Mr. Berger said conforms to my understanding of the process. And I can speak to any details of the results of the phase 1 investigation.
Okay. All right. So let me stop there for a second. Let me turn to actually, Mr. Berger, while you're talking, talk about the related to the historic property as well as the archaeology. So if you want to pick that up as well.
Sure. As has been mentioned earlier today, this is a property that was identified as significant, designated as a historic site in the county's first historic sites and districts plan in 1981. Its architectural and historical significance and associations are obvious to the trained eye, if not the naked eye. And the property's been protected under Subtitle 29 for more than 40 years because we recognize what its significance was and is. In the context of the development of the surrounding community, the rectangular parcel that you see before you and the associated family cemetery to the east across the road were exempted from those development plans, which filled in around it. So Fairview and Cemetery was not actually a part of the Fairwood development. Although obviously it is subsumed in it today. At the time that all those development plans were being realized, the property was still in the hands of the Bowie family, as it had been for decades, certainly since the early part of the 19th century. And relatively recently, one of the last senior members of the Bowie family was interred in the cemetery across the street a couple of years ago, and the family still retains ownership and access to that. That being said, designation as a historic site effectively provides for a review of potential changes above the ground and below. So that is standing structures, historic landscape features like terracing, and there is some evidence of 19th century terracing on the south side of the house, and other agricultural outbuildings, in this case, historic roads and so forth, through the historic area work permit, that process that's administered by the county's Historic Preservation Commission. And as was noted earlier in the staff presentation, any proposed changes, including archaeological investigation that might lead to new construction, will be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission through the historic area work permit process, which would theoretically go hand in hand with a detailed site plan, such that the two applications would be reflective of one another, so that the detailed site plan would approve the work of the historic area work permit, and the historic area work permit would be reflected in what is approved in the detailed site plan. So unless you have any questions about that part of the process,
Let's see, is there any questions from Mr. Berger?
I've just got one question, Mr. Berger. I was looking at in the staff report, and it refers that the vice chair of the HPC voted present. Can you explain that if you know?
I don't remember which meeting that was.
April 19th, 2022 is a public meeting.
Okay. There are certain applications where either the chair or the vice chair, depending on who's running the meeting at any given moment, will choose to register their presence rather than to try to influence the outcome of a decision. Obviously, the chair or vice chair could break a tie should one exist, but in this case, that individual just merely decided that they would stay neutral on the issue. That's all that means.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Berger? Not, I'll turn to Mr. Baumgartner again, just in case you have any cross-examination for Mr. Berger.
Just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Berger or Mr. Prowse, given the historic use of this property, is there a possibility that there are human remains buried under the ground?
Well, there's always that possibility. I would hate to say never, but in a case such as this, we know where the family cemetery was and is. It's still there, but we don't necessarily know where the final resting place of any enslaved persons who were associated with this property might be or might have been. We know, obviously, that it was a very large plantation with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres reaching in all directions. So there could have been enslaved areas of settlement further afield from the house than closer to it. And there could be areas of burial associated with those locations. At this point, you can see the nature of the surrounding development. So there's no way of knowing whether any such burials could still be found. Although, of course, a similar process was undertaken in the context of the Fairwood development when archaeological investigations were conducted for that purpose at that time. Nothing was revealed.
Understood. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, if no more questions from Mr. Berger, moving on from historic quickly to Ms. Gupta, and really the only thing I think to have you affirm that this question, there was a question around, is there any need for additional easements, and if so, what is our relationship to that process.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. This is Sherry Connor with the subdivision section. I can field that one. Regarding the easements, we're not sure at this point whether there will be any need for additional easements. We'll know more when the applicant comes in at future development stages with their site plan review. At this existing time, they do have existing easements in place for access to the property. If the applicant wishes to work with the property owner, abutting property owner, which is the HOA, to obtain additional easements for sidewalks and or any grading necessary to implement their access, they will have to do that via private easement agreement with the HOA. Our only role in that will be that they reflect any easement that is existing or proposed on their site plan.
Thank you, Ms. Connor. Any questions for Ms. Connor from commissioners? Mr. Baumgartner, any cross?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Connor. Thanks all. And then the last issue that was before us, and this would be for Mr. Goldsmith, there's a question around that a few people brought up related to the master plan as they're describing the master plan. So if you could touch on that a bit, would appreciate it.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Peter Goldsmith, Senior Counsel. What I think the reference to the Fairview Master Plan, when the reference to the Fairview Master Plan is not the way the code applies that term, and I think the way we understand it. I mean, based on what was provided in the backup, I think they are referring to a drawing which is reproduced, I think, on page 127 of 153 of the backup, just for the board's reference. And that's not referring to the applicable master plan, which is the 2022 approved Bowie Mitchellville and vicinity master plan. And so when staff is finding conformance to the master plan, what we mean is we're finding conformance to the Bowie master plan. And then, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just want to address there was an assertion about the tree variance standards that I'd like to. Okay, please. So regarding whether the tree variance criteria are met, I don't agree with the assertion that the circumstances for removal of the 2 historic trees are based on conditions or circumstances that are the result of actions taken by the applicant. What the criterion means is whether the applicant is asking for the variance because they have already removed the trees and are coming in after the fact to ask for the variance. And so the applicant has not taken any action on the site except for requesting the removal of the 2 trees. And they appear to be located where the access easement or near where the access easement is located, which is, I think, why the applicant is asking for removal.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks for that clarification. So commissioners, thank you, Mr. Goldsmith. So commissioners, any other questions for staff? We've heard from a bunch of different staff on a bunch of different issues. Is there anything else that you have that you would like to ask staff before we turn back to the applicant for any rebuttal and close?
All my questions were addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My questions were addressed as well, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chair Bailey, you're on mute, but I think I read your lips and you said your questions are addressed as well.
Yeah, no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair. Okay, with that, I will turn to Mr. Taub for any rebuttal and close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I appreciate your attention to this important application this morning and your comments with regard to it. Just a few comments here. Number one, with regard to the traffic study, I would just note overall that this study was performed pursuant to the guidelines established by the commission. It was evaluated under those guidelines by your own staff, your transportation staff, which specializes in transportation engineering, and was found to be adequate for the purpose intended. There's no experts presented today to in any way undermine or undercut any of the conclusions reached by the study itself. And I would note, almost as an aside, but that the threshold number of trips before a traffic study is even required is 50. That's standard practice in your transportation section. This was barely over that. This study, as you can see, the conditions, or rather the results, were, let me see, 56 AM peak hour trips and 10 PM peak hour trips. So we were very close to even barely getting over the threshold for the requirement of a traffic impact study. Now, we wanted to do that in any case because we wanted the community and we wanted the planning board to be assured that this would not be a problem. But I think it's important to understand that this is more that the results showed that there is adequacy, and that conclusion has not been undermined in any way. I think it's also important to understand that this property, Fairview, was not included within the Fairwood development. I think Mr. Goldsmith described it correctly, that the so-called master plan that was being discussed here, sort of generically, I believe, really refers to the concept plan or the development plans for Fairwood. And as you can see, the entirety of Fairwood was zoned MXC, whereas this property was then and remains today zoned RE, residential estate. And so I think that it's important to understand that this property is not subject in any way to the covenants of the Fairwood community or in any other way under the control of the Fairwood community. Again, not to say that we're not being sensitive to the concerns of the community. We absolutely are and will continue to be. But I think technically it's important to understand there's a difference between this property and the balance of the Fairwood community. The historic nature of the property, of course, is being recognized and of course will be respected by my client. We have done everything that is required to be done with regard to the investigation of the property, as Mr. Berger indicated, Mr. Pallas indicated. We will continue to work as we go through the next step of this process, the detailed site plan that will also be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission. And there are conditions even on this application that relate to the potential for further exploration under certain circumstances. And we understand that, and any application for a permit, whether it be grading, building permit, or anything else, is going to require a historic area work permit. So this is going to be under, I assure you, the watchful eye of the Historic Preservation Commission, and they will make a recommendation to this board when it comes to the detailed site plan. I think it's important also that I just want to make one statement about the school itself. There have been statements made that seem to indicate that this is going to be much more than a school and to have private events and all kinds of things here. My client intends this to operate as a school. That is her purpose. That is the intent. That will be the result. And there have been discussions about other possible events here, including those that we may offer to the homeowner association if they wish to have some. But believe me, that is not the primary use of this property. Will be as a school. There may be, as in any school, there will be maybe several events during the year that may involve other people beyond that, but very much so, this is going to be a school. That's the purpose, that's the intent. It is not going to vary from that. In every other case, the staff has evaluated every single issue. They have provided conditions where appropriate. The evaluation has been exactly as it has been done for many, many, many applications of this nature, for other preliminary plans of subdivision. And again, I want to emphasize, we are here to discuss the preliminary plan, not the detailed site plan. We will, of course, deal with issues such as parking and circulation on property and other issues that will deal more specifically with the nature of the school as we get to the detailed site plan. I would suggest to you also that the concern about the nature of the school is misplaced. Once the application is approved, we can go forward with this and we will have to describe to you the nature of the school. It may be, I would just say theoretically, the school could absolutely meet, the requirements of the citizens here in their respect. May or may not, but the fact is that issue will be dealt with by the planning board at the detailed site plan stage. And so we believe that this application has been fully evaluated, been fully vetted. The conditions are addressed, will be addressed as required. And we believe there is no basis for the board to do anything but accept the staff recommendation. And we would respectfully request that you do so, including all the conditions as proposed to be amended. Thank you very much. Again, appreciate your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taub. So that concludes this public hearing. We've heard extensive testimony in support and in opposition to this. We have staff recommending approval. Commissioners, I'm comfortable with this moving forward, and I would turn to you to see if there's a motion to approve this preliminary plan subdivision.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion. And before doing, would like to thank the citizens for coming out and expressing their concerns and testimony. We always appreciate that kind of engagement. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I move that we adopt the findings of staff and approve preliminary plan 4-21047 and TCP 1-008-2022 and variance to section 25-122B1G, along with the associated conditions as outlined in staff's report and as modified as follows. Condition 12B as modified by applicant exhibit number 1. Condition number 13 as modified and read into the record by Ms. Gupta, and new condition 14 as read into the record by Ms. Gupta.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on the motion? I will call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Mr. Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye, and I would like to associate myself with Commissioner Washington's earlier comments. I vote aye.
And discussion of my vote as well, I would join with Vice Chair Bailey and associate myself with Commissioner Washington's remarks. I thought it was a robust discussion. I really appreciate all the input from folks in the community. Thoughtful, measured, well-researched. We hear the concerns loud and clear. There's many bites at this apple. I know you'll keep a watchful eye on this project as it moves forward. I also want to thank the staff for all the hard work that's been done and for all the contributions to help us make our decisions as thoughtfully as we can. So with that, I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0. Thanks everybody for your time on this case. So what's last before us? What's last before us is we're going back to item 3A, which is a legislative work session. We have 3 bills that are before us, and staff will describe and give us their recommendations on these 3 bills for us to consider. So I'll turn to staff, and we have we'll start with CB 58 2022.
Good afternoon, Chairman Shapiro and members of the Planning Board. My name is Raina Hightower, Intergovernmental Affairs Coordinator. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. I'd like to tell you that CB 58 2022 amends the repealed zoning ordinance to permit a contractor's office in the formerly existing RR and R55 zones under certain circumstances. Staff believes that this bill was drafted for a property located at 8701 Old Browns Lane. And it takes advantage of the prior zoning ordinance. The new zoning ordinance replaced the prior zoning ordinance effective April 1st, 2022. the council never contemplated that the repealed ordinance would continue to be amended. Therefore, staff questions whether this bill or entertaining a bill that enacts legislation for a repealed ordinance is even legal. Staff recommends that the planning board vote to oppose CB 58 2022. Thank you. That concludes my presentation on that bill.
Thank you. Let me start with this one, because I share staff's concerns on this. If we start down the road of amending the previous zoning ordinance, I don't even know, setting aside whether it's even legal or not, we're going to get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. So I appreciate staff's recommendation on this, and that's certainly the direction that I would go. Are there questions for Ms. Hightower or Mr. Hunt on CB 58 2022?
No questions, but vote to oppose.
And I would second.
Okay, we have a motion by Vice Chair Bailey, a second by Commissioner Washington. Any further discussion on the motion? I'll call the roll. Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0 to oppose CB staff's support staff's recommendation and oppose CB 58 2022. Next before us is CB 60 2022. Ms. Hightower.
Yes, this bill amends the pre-application neighborhood meeting informational mailing regulations to require the applicant to provide the planning department with an electronic version of the informational meeting materials before a development application is accepted. Staff must also create and maintain an email registry to send the informational mailing materials to residents. While we are supportive of providing informational notification to residents, this bill will require additional staff, time, and resources. The email registry will have to be consistently updated with constantly changing information. The materials sent via email could overload some residents' email mailboxes. Staff is not able to determine that an email address is associated with a physical address or to track when a citizen moves. The email registry database will become a list of email addresses and not a database of citizens affected by proposed development applications. If the county council decides to go forward with this bill, we recommend that they amend the bill to require the applicant to email the pre-application neighborhood meeting materials to the residents themselves. Again, we are supportive of providing notification, but do not believe that this is the most effective and efficient way to accomplish that goal. Therefore, staff recommends that the planning board vote to oppose CB 60 2022 as drafted.
Ms. Hightower, what exactly
Yes,
is
ma'am.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
What exactly is included in the mailing that's being referenced?
A number of things.
Information.
The date and the time of the meeting, the sketch plan for the development application, a summary of the development proposal, the type of development approval sought, the application number, the MNPPC contact information, the applicant contact information, the process for becoming a party of record, the statement that no government agency has reviewed this application. There are a number of things that
No, thank you very much for that. And I do share your concerns with regards to the labor intensity this would cause and create. And the reason I was asking about the content was I wonder if there's already a platform. I think about PG Atlas, for example, where residents can go in and subscribe, to receive certain types of information. Seems to me that some sort of platform like that would be more ideal, as opposed to the onus being on, quite frankly, the applicant or us having to your point, send out emails to everybody because we don't know if one, people want it. I think we all get enough spam, or at least I do, that
I only
Right.
want in my inbox what I asked to be in my inbox, so. That is correct. And I'd like to make it clear that this information is already being mailed to citizens that are affected by the development application.
Okay.
This is in addition to the mailing that they already would receive.
Yeah, and my 2 cents on this is it feels like it's the beginnings of a really good idea, an important idea, and it moves us forward, and it moves us forward. It's just there's a lot more discussion that has to take place, and I feel like this is an opportunity, and to be in dialogue with the council about the best way to do this, and also to make sure that we have plenty of time to implement it. Imagine if they were to approve this, and then we'd have 4 to 5 days to implement this. That would be impossible,
Right.
given our resources. So it just feels more like good idea. Let's have a conversation about it.
And Mr. Chairman, it's more than time, it's time and staff.
Time and staff. Thank you. Okay, so we have a. I'm sorry.
No, I agree with you. I just think it's onerous in terms of staff, the timing. I mean, I understand the purpose of it, but I just don't think it's like you say, we need to have a conversation with the council.
Right, and I think if we take staff's recommendation to oppose this, it's clear that it's opposed as drafted, and that we want to make it clear, and our message I think should be that we're quite open to this.
Absolutely.
But after my dialogue.
Yep, I agree.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's really the
Okay.
vehicle, right?
Right.
So with that, I move that we accept staff's recommendation and oppose as drafted, and ensure the transmittal includes comments under your signature, Mr. Chairman, codifying this brief discussion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Motion and second. Motion by Commissioner Washington, second by Commissioner Giraldo. Any discussion on the motion? Not, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0 to support staff's recommendation to oppose CB 60 2022 as drafted, and reflecting this conversation here. Last, we have CB 61 2022. Ms. Hightower.
This bill requires the written summary from the pre-application neighborhood meeting to become part of the administrative record of the development application. The applicant must email a copy of the written summary to all attendees who provide an email address under this legislation. The new zoning ordinance expanded the informational mailing regulations to require a pre-application neighborhood meeting. After the meeting, as part of the new zoning ordinance, the applicant prepares a written summary of the meeting. The council's goal in creating a pre-application neighborhood meeting was to create a dialogue between applicants and residents early on in the development review process. The council did discuss requiring the meetings and summaries to become part of the administrative record, but decided the meeting and written summary should be informal and informational, not part of the administrative record during the deliberations for the new zoning ordinance. They were concerned that requiring written summaries to become part of the record could introduce into the record information or opinions that are not relevant to deliberations that the planning board or the council would take on in their decision-making process. They believe adding written summaries to the administrative record, this is the council, could create unreasonable expectations for the public. Staff believes it is premature to make substantive changes to the new zoning ordinance, which has only been in effect for 3 months. Council will conduct a comprehensive review of the new zoning ordinance after 18 months or in 2023. This bill should be considered at that time. Therefore, staff recommends that the planning board vote to oppose CB 61 2022. And that
Thank you.
concludes my comments. Thank you.
Questions? Ms. Hightower? It feels pretty straightforward that this is putting the cart before the horse. We have no idea. Hasn't even been tried once yet, and the rules are changing. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Doesn't make sense to support.
Nah.
Nope.
I move that we accept the recommendation of staff, Mr. Chairman.
I second it. Thank you, Ms. Hightower.
And whatever.
Whatever. We have a motion by Commissioner Washington, a second by Commissioner Giraldo. Any further discussion on the motion? I will call the roll. Commissioner Washington.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bailey, Vice Chair Bailey.
Vote aye.
I vote aye as well. The ayes have it 4-0 to accept staff's recommendation and to oppose CB 61 2022. And again, under explanation, just to make sure that in our communication we're reflecting that this is something that we will be monitoring and evaluating and are looking forward to taking up in a year's time or in 18 months time when we have more information.
Right.
Right.
Okay. I believe that concludes all the items for today's agenda. I want to thank staff and everybody else for all the hard work today. It was a very productive day. Mr. Hunt, any further business to come before the planning board today?
Mr. Chair, no additional business items are before the planning board today. Thank you.
Thank you. And then with that,
And a huge
thank you
hearty
all.
thanks to staff. Great job today.
Yeah, nice job. Really
Yeah.
well done.
Mhm.